Chapter 1, Reunion. A silver moon hung low over the endless sea, illuminating a small, tree-cloaked island. On its shore sat a thin, raggedly dressed boy, no older than 15. His hollow cheeks and sunken eyes spoke of months without proper food, yet in his hand he held something precious, a small, feathered creature the size of a child's knee. By moonlight, the bird's plumage appeared midnight black, each feather catching the glow as if dusted with starlight. The boy stared at it, heart hammering with a mix of longing and disbelief. At last, he lifted a trembling hand and traced a fingertip along the creature's downy breast. His breath caught. For a moment, he froze, as if weighing the impossible against his memories. Then he exhaled, resolved. "I never thought you'd come back," he whispered. Around them, the night was alive with distant waves and rustling leaves, as though the island itself had paused to witness their reunion. The boy, Ethan, had once been hailed as a quasi-heavenly king, a prodigy among trainers. He remembered in fragments how Team Rocket had seized him, dragging him before a tribunal for crimes he did not commit. He had nearly perished in that trial, barely clinging to life before escaping into the wild. Now at last reunited with his first partner, all the pain and hardship of his captivity fell away. In the gentle rise and fall of its chest, he found proof that hope could survive even the darkest trials. Ethan smiled for the first time in months. "Let's go home." Ethan had built his reputation on the back of skills from his past life and his extraordinary abilities. In the underground arena, he was a rising star, feared and respected. But in the latest league siege, his rivals, ironically, two other fighters who also called themselves Heavenly Kings, laid a deadly trap. Flush with confidence after earning his own Heavenly King promotion, Ethan never suspected they would strike so ruthlessly. Without warning, they overpowered him and buried him alive. When he finally regained consciousness, the world around him was pitch black. He forced himself to sit up and stretched out a trembling hand. To his astonishment, every scar from past battles and grueling training had vanished. His skin, once calloused and yellowed from malnutrition, was now so thin that veins and bone structure stood out in sharp relief. Clenching his fist as hard as he could, he felt his nails crack and crumble into his palm. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone raven let out a harsh caw. Ethan heard its cry, and despite the pain that shot through his hand, managed to pull the corner of his mouth into a grim smile. He didn't know how long he'd been down here, or whether rescue would ever come, but one thing was certain, this was far from over. My face muscles, long unused to joy, seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Hesitantly, I reach out and brush my hand over Dark Crow's back. His feathers are unkempt, his body too thin. "Dark Crow, it's good to be with you again," I whisper, voice wavering. In my last life, everything was cold and unchanging. By the time I realized I needed to change, it was too late. Yet through it all, from my very first days as a trainer to that final, desperate moment, Dark Crow never left my side. He was more than a battle partner. He was my guardian, my friend. Unlike the supposedly powerful Pokémon I'd snapped up by force or coin, he never wavered. He alone carried me through my darkest hours. He is both my greatest blessing and my deepest regret. Dark Crow tilts his head and emits a soft, curious caw. I don't know why, but in that single cry I feel the thread of our bond tighten. Although we've only just met, he makes no move to attack or flee. He simply watches me with bright, intelligent eyes. I stand there, stunned, as he waits for what comes next. You should know that the first time I met Dark Crow in my past life, capturing it was only the beginning. Truly understanding this first contact creature demanded far more effort. I still regret every wasted moment. Before that, my only Pokémon knowledge came from watching a few anime episodes, like the vague tale of a trainer named Ga and his magical Pikachu, and I barely recognized the different elf species, let alone their traits, moves, or ideal training methods. In this world, people say an elf's ceiling is set by its innate talent, while its floor depends on the trainer's skill. I had no idea how many hours slipped through my fingers before I unlocked Dark Crow's true nature. By the time I devised the perfect cultivation regimen, part of its raw potential had already been lost. In my previous life, the only reason we shone during the trials was Dark Crow's natural gifts. Everything else was born of my blind detours. This time, I refused to let that talent go to waste. Ethan felt the last of his memories returning, a consequence of overtaxing Murkrow's power. The gaps in his mind, shadows born of exhaustion, were steadily fading. He reached out and gently pressed his hand against Murkrow's glossy wing. His fingers trembled. "Murkrow," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. "I'll never let you go again." At his words, Murkrow tilted his head and let out a soft "Ka!" a perfectly timed response, as though the dark-feathered Pokémon understood Ethan's vow. The edge left Ethan's shoulders, and a small, relieved smile spread across his face. He couldn't help but think how close he'd come to being abandoned on this uninhabited island, thrown to the mercies of Team Rocket's assigned Pokémon and left to fend for himself. Most of the creatures Rocket had handed out were ruthless, swarms of Zubat, clouds of coughing, and slithering Arbok. Murkrow was the only one Ethan had ever formed a real bond with, and it was thanks to Murkrow that he'd been able to clear the trial of the wild. Now, with the first stage upon him, Ethan gripped his Pokeball. This wasn't some children's show. These were living, untamed Pokémon. On these shores, wild creatures often struck immediately upon release, injuring their trainers and then disappearing into the undergrowth. Many hopeful challengers never made it past that first encounter. Heart-pounding, Ethan took a steadying breath. By his side, Murkrow ruffled his feathers and fixed Ethan with a knowing gaze. The real test was about to begin. Ethan couldn't shake the numbers from his mind. 300 candidates had begun the trials, girls barely in their teens, between 15 and 18 years old. By the end of the first stage, the famed Elf Taming Challenge, only about 150 to 160 remained. It was the cruelest cut of all. Nearly half the contestants were eliminated at once, and elimination here meant only one thing: death. When the trials finally concluded, just 50 participants would survive. Those 50 would be absorbed into the Rocket's various squads and divisions as reserve members. But survival alone wasn't enough. Rank determined everything. The top 10 scorers would have the privilege of choosing which branch they joined, and the top 3 among them would enter as captains. And then there was the ultimate reward. First place in the trial guaranteed a rare Imperial-class elf. Usangia elves were legendary, scarcely seen outside the Alliance's fee-paying elite. The Rocket's own prize was always an elf with exceptional potential. Ethan vaguely recalled that, in the previous trial, the champion had been granted an extraordinary frogseed elf, an unheard-of treasure among even the most seasoned trainers. Ethan had always been a prodigy among Froakie trainers, and it was precisely this rare talent that vaulted him into the ranks as a regional leader of Team Rocket. His power now met, if not slightly exceeded, the threshold for what they called a heavenly king, leaving him tantalizingly one step away from the pinnacle. As the centerpiece of Rocket's elite training program, he was under constant scrutiny. Whispers said he was being groomed to stand among the next generation of the famed 4 generals. Even so, Ethan knew he wasn't yet the very best. Though his own progress was nothing short of impressive, he still trailed behind the top candidate, and, since he wasn't on the direct succession track, he'd learned next to nothing about that rival's development. Aya brushed a fine layer of dust from her uniform as Ethan pushed himself upright. A strange heaviness weighed on his limbs. In his previous life, by this point his system chip would have been up and running. Steeling himself, he closed his eyes and spoke the words he'd rehearsed countless times. System, initialize. A steady, metallic drip echoed in his mind. Chip initializing. 10 seconds crawled by. Ethan's heart pounded as he braced for disappointment. Then a cool mechanical voice swelled in his head, utterly devoid of emotion. Boot sequence complete. System online. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, just as he'd predicted. Chapter 2. Chip Activation. I couldn't hide my excitement. This chip had come through the portal with me into this world. In my past life, I owed all my Jun Tianwang level prowess to this very device. I'd activated it by accident, back when I'd been ripped away and dropped miles from safety. Even then, the chip's assistance had made chasing my pursuers possible, albeit still a grueling task. Now, standing in this strange new realm, I forced myself to stay calm. Heart-pounding, I spoke softly to the little sentinel that hovered at my side, my dark, crow-shaped AI companion. Chip, scan. No sooner had the words left my lips than I felt the device hum to life. A series of fine blue lines wove through the air before me, coalescing into a three-dimensional hologram. Data streams flickered across its surface, physiological metrics, environmental readings, even an aerial map overlay. I watched, breath held, as the chip's analysis unfolded. Here it was again, my lifeline, my secret weapon, and this time I intended to use it with purpose. Chapter 5: Dark Raven's Data. Ethan hovered over the translucent display, his eyes glowing with anticipation. The holographic panel before him pulsed softly, each line of text revealing the hidden depths of his newly captured Pokémon, a Dark Raven. Name: Dark Raven. Type: Dark Flying. Gender: Male, level 8 characteristics. Nature: Mischievous. Ability: Prankster, moves that alter status can be used first. Held item: None. Genetic moves: Punishment, Dark Physical, base power 60 plus 20 for each rank of increased stats. Surprise Strike, Dark Physical, power 60, never misses. Feather Rest, Flyitus, restores 50% HP, grounds. Dark Raven base moves. Peck, Flying Physical, power 40. Scare, Ghost Physical, power 30, 30% chance to induce flinching. Pursue, Dark Physical, power 40. Double damage if the target is switching out TMHM moves. Snatch, Dark Status, redirects and steals certain moves or abilities. Tailwind, Flying, status, doubles the team's speed for 4 turns. Skill tutor moves: None. Ethan scrolled through every entry, memorizing stat by stat: HP, attack, defense, speed, and special attack. He knew that in his previous life, before the neural chip had awoken, every slot had been blank, an untouched canvas waiting for data. Since then, he'd gathered information through simulator runs, battle logs, and even direct scans of wild Pokémon. Every shred of data was categorized, cross-referenced, and stored in his mind. A smile tugged at his lips. This Dark Raven was no ordinary avian. Its dark typing and prankster nature made it a formidable strategist. If Ethan could train it properly, the Raven's blend of surprise moves and speed would give them a decisive edge. He tapped the display once more. The hologram winked out, leaving Ethan alone in the dim light of the lab. Tomorrow, he'd begin training. With these stats in hand, and with Dark Raven by his side, Ethan felt more prepared than ever to face the challenges ahead. Only when he reached the final logs did the full scope of the information become clear. Ethan had scoured nearly every rocket database within his reach, and even breached systems well beyond his official clearance. He'd executed multiple incursions into the Alliance's archives, all to piece together this complete dossier. As a civilian trainer, he knew that mastery begins with knowledge. Only by understanding an elf's true capabilities could he tailor his training to unlock its full potential. Now, looking over the data on Dark Crow, Ethan felt a thrill of excitement. He'd never seen such comprehensive records, right down to the microchip's encoded battle history. As before, the color-coding system beside each elf's name charted its natural aptitude. Red and orange qualifiers, he reminded himself, were most common in the wild. Green marked a solid mid-tier talent, not to be underestimated. In the full rainbow of rankings, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, green sat squarely in the center. Dark Crow's green qualification meant it had raw promise waiting to be honed. With these insights in hand, Ethan was more determined than ever to see what this mysterious elf could achieve. Ethan knew that even a yellow elf, with its unusual traits, would be snatched up by ambitious trainers the moment it showed promise. Green qualified elves, then, were practically treasures. He estimated that among the batch of elves the rocket team had allocated this time, fewer than 10 would earn that coveted green grade. And yet Rocket had already handpicked these recruits, betting on their potential before they'd even proven themselves. In his last life, Ethan had managed to climb to 34th place on Trial Island, riding on a single green-qualified Dark Crow. The bird's natural talent had carried him through every challenge. His own skills as a trainer had barely registered. This time, he vowed it would be different. He drew in a steadying breath. Weakness was his original sin, and on Trial Island, the only law was, the strong feed on the weak. To survive, he had to turn that bird into something formidable. The first order of business was undoing the losses his Dark Crow had suffered early on. A typical Dark Crow stood about half a meter tall, his barely reached 40 centimeters. There was no time to waste. If he wanted to be among the strong, he'd have to begin by strengthening the one partner he already had. Ethan knew that unless they replenished their ravaged bodies, they would never fully realize their talents or advance their cultivation. He crouched on the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line, then called softly, "Come on, Dark Crow. Let's find something to eat." He offered his shoulder as a perch. The sleek black bird hesitated. Its beady eyes flicked over Ethan's lean frame, a stark contrast to the frail, undernourished 15-year-old it once knew. After a moment's pause, the crow spread its wings and settled down, its weight pressing into his shoulder blades so that his footprints sank deeper into the sand. Together, they stepped into the woods. As a member of the rocket team that had broken through from the lowest level, Ethan relied on his survival training, which fruits were safe, which were poisonous, which would quickly restore strength, and which could counteract lingering toxins. He reached up, picked a handful of orange-yellow berries, and tossed them to the crow. Then he plucked one of the firmer, green-tinged fruits nearby and bit into it. The tart juice slid over his lips, stinging his tongue, but he welcomed the burning reminder of life. He chewed slowly, savoring the tough flesh as it slid down with a rush of much-needed energy. Replenished, Ethan straightened. Dark Crow croaked softly, flapped its wings, and flew ahead, scouting for their next meal. Together they pressed deeper into the forest, ready to face whatever challenges lay beyond the trees. This fruit was the most common tonic for restoring vitality in the wild, but because they were deep in wild elf territory, few berries ever ripened fully. After feeding the Dark Crow the plumpest pieces, Ethan had to make do with the harder, underripe ones, less potent but better than nothing. Caw! The raven swallowed another chunk and then fixed Ethan with bright, unusually gentle eyes. Only yesterday they'd met, and yet the bird had spared him the best of the loot while it ate the tougher fruit itself. A warmth spread through Ethan's chest. He hadn't felt this kind of care since leaving home. "Go ahead, Dark Crow. I know you'd prefer meat, but this is all we've got," Ethan said, offering the rest of his handful. The raven tapped his cheek lightly with its beak, as if to say, "No worries." Ethan smiled and reached up to stroke the bird's sleek feathers. Even if tomorrow brought his end, the image of the Dark Crow perched loyally on his shoulder filled him with a surprising comfort. What he regretted losing in his past life, he now treasured above all else. Ethan walked slowly along the forest trail, his boots leaving a trail of shallow prints in the soft earth. At last he paused before a dense thicket. From long experience, he knew that wherever this kind of brush grew, small game often lurked, and sometimes, though rarely, even elves. He waited. Then, in a flash of gray, a wild hare burst from the undergrowth. Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "Dinner," he said softly. He raised his arm and issued his command. "Dark Crow, attack!" At once, a large black crow swooped down, its beak striking the hare with lethal precision. The creature collapsed without a sound. The crow landed nearby, ruffling its feathers in triumph. Before Ethan could approach, a slender figure draped in violet light sprang from the shadows. In the blink of an eye, the hare's body dissolved into drifting motes of purple and vanished. The spirit turned to Ethan, its eyes gleaming with otherworldly hunger. Ethan nodded calmly. In this world, animals like hares were prey for carnivorous spirits. Elves, however, were elsewhere in the food chain. For now, the hunt was over, and tonight's meal belonged to the spirit. He merely watched, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 3. Encounter in the Thicket. Ethan and his dark raven froze in astonishment. A flash of lilac fur darted from the undergrowth, and with it, the rabbit that Dark Raven had just driven out of its hiding place. Before they could react, the little creature's whiskers bristled, its keen eyes glinting. Then, with a sudden crackle of electricity, it yanked the rabbit carcass away from Dark Raven's talons. Squawk! Dark Raven squawked in outrage, wings ruffling as it lunged forward. Its beak, pale yellow and razor-sharp, gleamed with cold fury. If Ethan hadn't reached out to restrain it, the raven would have attacked on the spot. Ethan drew a sharp breath. The intruder was a rattata, a sleek, lilac-colored rodent barely a foot tall but brimming with courage. He slipped a hand into his pack and pressed a button on his Pokégear, bringing up the newcomer's data. Pokémon, Rattata. Gender, male, level 10. Type, normal ability, run away. Held item, none. Moves, tackle, tail whip, thundershock, smokescreen, bite. No special teaching skills, no inherited genetic talents. Yet in that single thundershock, Rattata had managed to snatch away the prize of a powerful trained Pokémon. Ethan met Rattata's fearless gaze. Dark Raven hunkered on his shoulder, still bristling but silent under Ethan's firm hand. "Looks like we've got company," Ethan murmured. "Let's see what else you've got, little guy." With that, he gave Dark Raven the signal to stand down, for now, and prepared to discover just how formidable this plucky Rattata could be. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the underbrush. A flash of red fur emerged. The little Rata, one of the island's most common denizens, had come to meet him. On paper, it was 2 levels above his dark crow, but Ethan knew better than to read too much into raw numbers. "Since you've made the first move, you'll face Dark Crow," he said evenly. The Rata hadn't crept from the shadows without reason. Ethan had already guessed its strategy. A clever opponent never stayed hidden simply to be ambushed. It was bait. "Dark Crow, windward," he ordered. A soft breeze sprang up around his companion, lifting its midnight black wings and sharpening its reflexes. In both the wild and the game, speed was decisive, and with Dark Crow's base speed at 91, plus the wind's boost, it would easily outsprint even a Rata of equal level. "Peck!" Dark Crow screeched, diving through the trees in a single, precise strike. Under the cloak of night, its obsidian feathers became a blur, and the creature's beak struck true. In the jungle, the rule was simple. The strong preyed on the weak without mercy. As a flash of black light cut through the darkness, Ethan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. His wager had paid off. Before Rata could even react, Ethan's Dark Crow swooped in. Its razor-sharp beak struck the little elf's side, eliciting a high, pained squeal. Lara gasped too late. Rata was already spinning away, his slender legs carrying him in desperate flight. "Dark Crow, intimidate him," Ethan ordered. He knew Rata's nature. Once frightened, the elf would panic and become easy prey. Obeying Ethan's command, the crow let out a harsh, echoing caw that rattled through the clearing. Rata halted mid-stride, clutching his wound. Fear gripped him so suddenly he could barely breathe. The Frighten skill, designed to sow terror with a mere 30% base chance of forcing cowering, felt all but certain under Ethan's practiced control. "After him! Dark Crows, peck him relentlessly!" Ethan's voice was icy and devoid of mercy. To him, any enemy, no matter how small or weak, deserved nothing less than absolute dominance. The next morning on the trial island, Ethan reminded himself of the iron rule he'd learned long ago. Never show mercy. Weakness can be a deadly trap. Lada, his opponent, lay on the scorched ground, too exhausted to rise. Beside him, the Dark Crow hovered, its black feathers ruffling as it awaited orders. "Finish it," Ethan said, his voice chillingly calm. The crow hesitated, its beady eyes flicking from Ethan to the fallen Lada. For a heartbeat, there was something almost like pity in its gaze. Then, with a soft flap of wings, it lunged forward, its sharp beak delivering the final blow. Lada's chest stilled, life bled away in silence. Ethan watched the creature collapse, a flicker of regret shadowing his own expression before he erased it. On this man-eating test island, mercy was the gravest mistake anyone could make. An injured foe might still conceal lethal strength. Seeing the Dark Crow hesitate only confirmed that he'd made the right decision, pushing his companion to obey without question. Here, the first drop of blood spilled was the key to survival and status among the rockets. Blood red was the color that commanded respect and fear. Ethan had internalized that brutal lesson over years of hardship. Now it was time to teach it to his elven protege. Ethan lingered at the edge of the clearing, the freshly killed hare cradled in one hand. A raven, its feathers as black as midnight, ruffled its wings twice and settled on his shoulder. The pair moved deeper into the forest in silence, their unspoken understanding growing stronger with every step. When they reached a small grove, Ethan knelt to gather twigs and dead leaves. He arranged a modest fire, then skewered the hare over the glowing embers. A drop of fat hissed as it fell into the blaze, sending up a thin wisp of smoke. There was no seasoning, only the pure, rich aroma of roasting meat. Below him, the raven hopped restlessly among the roots, eyes fixed on the cooking hare. The scent was irresistible. Every fiber of the bird's lean body quivered with hunger. Ethan glanced down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Hold on," he murmured. "It'll be ready soon." Moments later, the hare's hide had turned a deep bronze, and the flesh was tender all the way through. Ethan lifted it from the fire and, with careful precision, tore off one thick hind leg. He offered the rest to the raven, who pecked eagerly as Ethan sank to one knee and savored his own portion. In this lush, untouched wilderness, game was plump and plentiful, so much so that even one leg was more than enough for him. As he ate, Ethan felt the quiet bond between hunter and raven deepen, each dependent on the other to survive in the wild. Ethan felt a gentle warmth pulsing through his limbs, the residual energy left over from devouring the flesh-eating beast. He exhaled slowly, turning his gaze to the dark ravens perched nearby, each one having torn through the hair in 2 or 3 vicious strikes. Their bodies were as drained as his own, and he knew they would need time to recover. If he wanted to speed things up, he'd have to resort to medicinal fruits harvested from the ancient tree groves. Lower-tier healers might struggle to balance the potencies properly, but Ethan had a better option. He tapped the side of his neck, activating the small humming device embedded there. "Chip," he murmured, "locate energy blocks. I need enough cubes to restore our strength and rekindle the elves' innate talents." Energy cubes were the trump card of elven breeders, little crystalline orbs that, when consumed, flooded the body with precisely calibrated restorative energy. Thanks to the chip's guidance, Ethan could assemble them with uncanny accuracy. He'd done it countless times in a previous life, honing his craft to perfection. While most breeders measured materials by instinct, never quite sure if they'd hit the right ratio, Ethan could weigh ingredients down to 1,000th of a gram and control infusion times to within a millisecond. Other elven breeders might produce decent cubes on a good day, but Ethan's were flawless. With a soft hum of machinery and a swirl of emerald light, the first energy cubes began to take shape, promising swift recovery for both him and his loyal ravens. As soon as Ethan handed control over to the chip, every energy block it produced was perfectly identical, like exact copies. The formulas for all the blocks stored inside the chip had become one of his most valuable assets. With enough raw materials at his disposal, he could accelerate the elves' development in no time, ensuring that none of their talents went to waste. The moment he confirmed the production order, a detailed list of required components and their corresponding effects appeared before him. Chapter 4. The Energy Cube. Ethan tucked the recipe into his satchel and scanned it with growing excitement. This intermediate-grade item, the yellow core energy cube, served a single vital purpose: to replenish the missing elements in an elf's body, accelerate their physiological adjustments, and restore as much of their innate talent as possible. The list of ingredients was surprisingly straightforward: a handful of common forest fruits and a few easily foraged herbs. On an island as lush as this one, none of it would be hard to find. Best of all, the crafting process demanded no specialized machinery or arcane rituals, just the right raw materials and a simple alchemical circle. Perfect for him and the Dark Crow. Ethan closed his eyes and took a steadying breath. "Our first priority has to be gathering these ingredients," he said softly. "Training can wait until we've made the cubes." He hated the idea of pausing Dark Crow's combat drills. His companion's talent was too precious to leave untapped. But a frail body can't be pushed to its limits. Once the cubes were complete and Dark Crow had regained his strength, they could resume training more effectively than ever. Ethan was confident they'd catch up in no time. Over the next 3 days, the two of them trekked through the forest at dawn and dusk. They collected clusters of crimson berries from low-hanging branches, plucked silverleaf herbs from damp riverbanks, and searched mossy clearings for the golden petals of the sunvine flower. Each evening, they set up a small campfire and compared finds, tick-counting the quantities they'd gathered so far. Despite the hard work, Ethan found the routine oddly peaceful. The forest teemed with life. Cicadas droned in the underbrush, birds darted through sunlit glades, and the air carried the sweet tang of sap and wildflowers. With each step, Ethan felt more certain that this island, its resources, its quiet beauty, would play a pivotal role in Dark Crow's recovery. By the end of the 3rd day, their packs were heavy with harvested fruit and bundles of herbs. Ethan laid everything out on a flat stone, double-checking his collection against the recipe. A hopeful smile tugged at his lips. "All set," he said. Tomorrow we make cubes. Dark Crow nodded, his eyes bright with anticipation. Restoring his body was the first step. After that, they would return to training, and nothing would stand in their way. It had taken Ethan just over 3 days, stretching his supplies more than he'd planned, but he'd finished in time. Cradling the newly formed Huango energy cube in his palm, he appreciated its cool, glassy surface. Held up to the sun, fine, pulpy streaks swirled inside the cube's pale yellow translucence. Its skin was perfectly smooth, and a faint, fruity perfume drifted around him. For Ethan, crafting energy cubes was almost second nature. Every step of the process had gone off without a hitch. Now that he held the final product, it looked even better than he'd dared imagine. He'd discovered this recipe in a past life, but never had the chance to try it. He only hoped its legendary effects were real. With a deft flick of his finger, he sent the cube spinning into the air. Crackling arcs of blue lightning leapt from his shoulders and danced around the hovering cube, charging it with raw energy. At his side, the dark crow that watched the entire procedure flapped its wings in eager anticipation, its sharp eyes fixed on the levitating treat. Ethan offered a small, encouraging nod. The crow let out an excited caw, swooped upward, and snatched the cube mid-flight. It clamped its beak around the treat and tore off a piece. "Craw!" it squawked, as a burst of unfamiliar deliciousness spread across its tongue, proof that Ethan's long-held gamble had paid off. The dark crow opened its beak, closed its eyes in bliss, and let out a contented caw as it consumed the first cube. Ethan watched it fondly. "You like that, don't you?" he murmured. He'd prepared nearly 100 mid-tier energy cubes, powerful, but limited in daily intake. According to the Elven formula, a creature can only absorb 10 of these cubes per day. Any more would simply go to waste. Yet over the course of 7 consecutive days, 10 cubes a day would fully restore the elves' depleted reserves. Ethan set aside 9 cubes in a small cloth pouch tied at his waist and unwrapped the rest one by one. "Here you go," he said, tossing them into the crow's waiting maw. The bird snapped them up greedily. While he knew their effects wouldn't manifest all at once, he could already perceive a subtle shift in the dark crow's aura, its usually murky green glow growing richer and deeper with each cube. "That's enough for today," Ethan announced once the last cube was gone. He slipped his hand to the hilt of his training sword. "Now, to make sure you absorb all that energy, it's time to train. Ready to get stronger?" The dark crow threw back its head and cried out, feathers ruffling in anticipation. With that single powerful caw, their session began, and Ethan led the way. Dark Crow's greatest strength is his speed, and if we don't put his astonishing speed stat to good use, he'll never reach his full potential. Even better, his hidden ability, Mischievous Heart, grants priority to status moves, making him the perfect candidate for Tailwind. It's a game-changing combination. Dark Crow, use Tailwind. Ethan's command cuts through the tense air. Instantly, a soft, rushing breeze spirals around the sleek black feathers of Dark Crow. As the wind whips through the battlefield, every ally feels lighter on their feet. Their movements quicken almost before they realize it. Inside Dark Crow, the energy module he absorbed moments ago ignites, turning into a searing current that pulses through his limbs, fueling him with an unending surge of power. But all too soon, the tailwind fades and the breeze dies away. "Now, focus that tailwind so it only surrounds you," Ethan instructs, his voice calm but firm. "Learn to extend its duration. Speed isn't just about quick bursts, but sustained advantage. If you can maintain that wind around yourself, you'll keep your edge without burning through your energy." Dark Crow ruffles his feathers, eyes flashing with understanding. If he masters this control, channeling tailwind exclusively inward and stretching its effect, he could move faster than any opponent, endlessly, and with Mischievous Heart guiding his status moves to the front of every turn, no one would ever see him coming. Ethan watched intently as Dark Crow drew in the air around him, gathering a small vortex of wind and struggling to hold it. After nearly a minute, the swirling currents finally collapsed, dissipating as if he'd poured every last drop of strength into the effort. A ragged breath escaped the creature's throat. "Remember that feeling," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "Our goal is to keep the wind swirling around you continuously. Ready? Let's go again." "Keep it up. Maintain the wind cloak." Ethan urged, his eyes never leaving Dark Crow. Again and again, he repeated the command. Each time Dark Crow summoned the invisible currents, only to have them fizzle out moments later. From the moment training began, Ethan transformed into a strict instructor. Thanks to the implant in Dark Crow's mind, he could monitor exactly how much strain the creature endured. That way, he pushed just hard enough to expand its limits without causing injury, and never allowed slack when progress stalled. 3 days later, their hard work paid off. Where Dark Crow had once managed the wind cloak for barely a minute, he now sustained it for a full 10. Each attempt ended the same way. Dark Crow, unshaken, alighted on Ethan's shoulder, eyes bright with determination, eager to push the boundary once more. Ethan had planned to spend the weeks leading up to the final trial training alone in the forest, true to his nature. But the Rocket Corps had a standing order. Every member had to check in at headquarters once a week. Failure to report meant losing points, and at the end of this competition, every point counted. Vast training grounds were crowded with 300 competitors, each standing rigidly in neat rows across the central plaza. Vigilance and hostility flickered in every eye. After all, none of these challengers had ever lived to see the end of the trial before. In a place like this, everyone was a potential enemy. Ethan scanned the crowd, noting the handful of small alliances that had already formed. He felt a flicker of scorn. Banding together might work under ordinary circumstances, but when your very survival was on the line, nobody cared who else was with you. Alliances boiled down to nothing more than a few strong fighters watching each other's backs. In the final trial, raw power would decide who stood victorious and who fell. One thing united every competitor here. Each was shadowed by an elf familiar. Most were paired with the sleek, winged supersonic bats. A few bore serpentine Aba snakes or creatures cloaked in poisonous gas. A small number, like Ethan, had other, rarer elven companions at their side, all testament to the varied strengths each challenger brought to the field. With the weekly report behind him and his forest training looming ahead, Ethan stood ready. Whatever came next, he would meet it alone, and stronger than ever. Only 3 members of the Dark Crow squad remained after the count. Against the savage Abyss's snake and the deadly gas bomb, the supersonic bat felt almost like a household pet. To the novices who still couldn't summon even a basic chicken spirit, taming a wild elf was a true accomplishment, and anyone who could control the Abyss's snake or the gas bomb was certainly no weakling. A week of jungle survival had exposed the gap between strong and weak more clearly than ever. The capable only grew more formidable, while the less skilled fell further behind. In just 3 days of grueling training, despite only a handful of skirmishes, the Dark Crows had already reached level 10. Yet Ethan remained inconspicuous among them. The extra rations from recent days had begun to fill out his once gaunt frame, bringing a touch of color back to his pale cheeks. Silently, he drifted to a quiet corner of the plaza, folded his arms protectively across his chest, leaned against a weathered stone pillar, and lifted his gaze as though searching the sky for answers. Chapter 5. Viper Instructor. The clamor of the training square died away as a towering figure strode in, nearly 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably fierce. He wore a sharply pressed uniform and a military cap, the left breast stamped with a vivid red R. Behind him marched 10 Team Rocket operatives in identical uniforms, their faces hard and unreadable. Bringing up the rear was a massive houndoom, its coal-black coat bristling, 2 white bone horns curving backward from its skull, and a spiked tail swishing like a devil's lash. Ethan, who had been leaning against a nearby wall, felt the sudden hush and slowly opened one eye. Recognition struck him cold when he saw the man in front, the Viper Instructor himself. A flicker of steel crossed Ethan's gaze as he met Houndoom's glowing eyes. This was the moment he'd been dreading, yet somehow expecting. Pokémon profile, name Shadow Lugra, green, gender, male level 28, type Fire Dark, ability Blaze, held item none, genetic moves Flame Fang, Fire Vortex, basic moves Purgatory, Rogue Slash, Thunderfang, Stare, Spark, Wing Strike, Mist, Roar, Bite, Scent Detection, Siege, Tutor Move, Foul Play. TM moves Awakening Power, Rock, Shadow Ball, Fire Blast. Ethan studied Shadow Lugra's stats one more time and couldn't suppress a laugh. A level 28 Lugra with this moveset wasn't even in the top tier, maybe barely second tier. Deploy any one of his own second-tier Pokémon, and he could clear the entire field, Rocket's operatives included. There are actually 156 survivors this round, a cool, even voice announced. It wasn't loud, yet carried through the arena so every spectator could hear it. Quality batch 2. Heads turned, all eyes trained on the middle-aged man who'd spoken. He swept the square with a calm glance before continuing in the same measured tone. I am Viper, commander of Team Rocket's Purgatory Island Division. A hush fell over the crowd. The competition was about to begin. From now on, none of you will receive any special treatment, he announced, a wry smile playing on his lips as he watched the group absorb his words. The gathered trainees exchanged determined glances and nodded in agreement. The Purgatory trial will run for 3 months, he continued. We'll meet here once a week, miss 2 sessions in a row, and you automatically fail the trial, and you all know what failure brings. He paused, as if savoring their reaction, then pointed to a massive stone slab at the center of the courtyard. This is the trial stone. It measures the strength of your elven attacks. Each of you will take turns striking it. The data it records will determine your ranking. Every week, the top 10 scorers each earn 100 points. The rest receive decreasing amounts according to their placement. What you can exchange these points for should be obvious. He let that sink in before adding, points are the Rocket's exclusive currency. You can trade them for nearly anything in this world, especially resources controlled by the great noble houses. Gold won't buy you those, but points will. Rocket points could be spent not only on the island, but, once the trial ended, at any rocket base. Only 50 challengers would pass the trial. The top 10 scorers each earned 10,000 points, the top 3 received a Rocket Alliance ID card, and the champion got to choose one of 3 elite evolutions from the Rocket Warehouse. And the most important rule? There were no rules. Let the first ranking round begin. At that command, the snake-faced arbiter settled onto his ornate chair in the plaza's center and motioned to his clerks to start the records. Under the direction of a squad of rocket grunts, the contestants formed a neat line. When Ethan's turn came, he stepped forward with calm confidence. Abo, bite, he called. His purple serpent lunged at the massive boulder in the square's heart. Fangs glowed with a pale light before crushing the stone in one powerful snap. The boulder shattered, leaving rock no trace behind. Attack value 56, announced the recording officer in a flat tone. Contestant number 34, Ethan, 56 attack points. Ethan stood among the line of anxious teens, each numbered like an experiment in progress. A stern Team Rocket officer paced in front of a glowing stone slab, clipboard in hand. His sharp voice cut through the hush. Ready? First one, go! Next! Ethan, trainer number 34, pressed his lips into a thin line. He released his supersonic bat from its Pokeball. The creature hovered at eye level, its leathery wings twitching. Supersonic bat, use gust, Ethan ordered. The bat beat its wings once, then again, sending a twisting wind at the slab. A jagged crack echoed through the hall as the attack landed squarely. The stone glowed for a heartbeat, then displayed its verdict. Attack value 19. Ethan exhaled, dissatisfied, and stepped aside. He caught sight of the boy who'd tested before him, Trainer 13, smirking triumphantly. That boy had quietly watched Ethan's result, folding his arms in smug approval. Number 13, attack value 19, currently in second place, the officer announced without expression. Next, Trainer 24 hustled forward. His creature, a sleek steel type, struck with precision. The slab flashed again, attack value 25. Number 24 takes second, the officer continued. Next, one by one, each trainer approached the slab. Number 98 unleashed a ferocious strike that shattered the previous high score. Attack value 45, vaulting him into first place. Number 77 followed, then 11, 42, and so on. With every result, the officer called out the new standings. As names and numbers flickered across the results board, the waiting teens shifted restlessly. Some glanced up at the leaders with begrudging envy. Others shot condescending looks at those who'd scored lower than themselves. The air throbbed with competitive tension. Ethan's heart pounded. He replayed his own test in his mind. If only he'd timed that gust more cleanly. Determined not to settle for a middling rank, He squared his shoulders. When the officer finally looked his way again, Ethan would be ready to reclaim his pride and aim for first place. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched the readings flicker across the summoning altar. He had been here before, in more than one lifetime, and he knew the truth all too well. The mightiest familiars only revealed themselves when their masters truly competed. Attack value 98. A hush fell over the courtyard. The display crystallized on the magical interface, setting a new mark. Standing before everyone was a slender boy, flawless complexion, immaculate attire, every movement dripping with aristocratic ease. Coiled at the boy's feet was an ether serpent, its scales shimmering like starlight as it lifted its head to challenge the world with contemptuous eyes. Ethan recognized him immediately. Number 99, Guga, last year's champion, the same boy who'd claimed first place in the Trial of Bonds, walking away with that fabled miracle frog seed, the legendary artifact said to fastest bolster a familiar's potential. From then on, Guga's reputation had only soared. Even when Ethan later unlocked a rare summoning chip of his own, he'd never managed to surpass him. For a long moment, no one else's attack value climbed higher than 98. Whispers drifted through the crowd. Guga's still unbeatable. He's on another level. At last, the announcer's gaze swept the line of candidates and landed on Ethan. Number 234, Ethan Harrow. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Ethan stepped forward, dark cloak brushing the marble floor. Atop his shoulder perched a sleek ebony crow, its eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. Ethan felt dozens of curious stares prick the back of his neck. Another one with a special familiar, someone whispered. I heard his crow is a rare, void-bound spirit. Ethan drew a steady breath, meeting the anxious eyes around him. This was his moment. If he could break Guga's record today, he might finally rewrite the story of all his past defeats. With a swift gesture, he reached for the eeling chip on his belt. The crow ruffled its feathers, cawing softly as it prepared to unveil its hidden strength. And in that instant, Ethan vowed, no matter what happened next, he would not let history repeat itself. The rocket team's assigned elves fall into three primary types: supersonic bats, abyssal serpents, and gas bombs, but they're often accompanied by other, far rarer species. Calling an elf special doesn't automatically make it superior to the standard three. It simply marks it as something alien to most handlers. A group of students leaned forward, smirking. Pathetic, one of them drawled. There's nothing remarkable about this dark crow. Just look how scrawny it is compared to the last one. It'll never measure up. Ethan met their taunts without the slightest flicker of emotion. He drew a steadying breath and issued his command in a clear, calm voice. Dark Crow, ride the wind, strike! At once, the jeers died on the students' lips. Their smug confidence melted into awkward glances as they realized their words had carried no weight. With a single, powerful beat of its wings, the dark crow launched into the sky. Pale white gusts swirled around its sleek form, a visible testament to the creature's latent power. After days of careful rehabilitation, it had finally reclaimed its full, imposing size. High above the arena, it banked in a wide circle, whipping the air into a suffocating vortex that left every onlooker gasping and silenced forever the skeptics who'd underestimated it. A massive stone hurtled through the air, driven only by gravity, and struck the target with a thunderous crack. In a single, graceful motion, it rebounded and came to rest squarely on Ethan's shoulder. He allowed himself a faint smile, eyes drifting open, brow lifting ever so slightly as he glanced back at the boulder, then strolled away without a word. Contestant 234, attack value 97, the announcer boomed. The number landed like a slap across the faces of the assembled challengers. Ethan's 97 placed him second overall, just behind Guga's 98, and well ahead of the next best score of 90. Even the recorders, never once sparing Ethan a glance as he melted into the crowd, quickly moved on to the next competitor. What they didn't know was that Ethan's dark crow technique alone couldn't generate such power. He had subtly harnessed the stone's own inertia and the pull of gravity on the downwind current to boost its force. A small trick, perhaps, but brutally effective. As Ethan walked off, several seasoned fighters fell into thoughtful silence, already piecing together the secret behind his performance. In their world, after all, rules were meant to be tested and transcended. The venomous serpent had watched Ethan through every step of the test. When he finally finished, the snake didn't retreat at once. Instead, it lingered a few more seconds, its unblinking gaze fixed on him. Curious little fellow, it seemed to decide. Chapter 6. Exchange. Since Ethan's breakthrough, no one has managed to outscore him. Yet, thanks to his demonstrations, everyone else adopted his techniques, and their own scores rose dramatically. Guga, who prided himself on achieving his results the hard way, refused to use any shortcuts. To him, anyone copying Ethan was just a lucky ghost, and he openly looked down on the rest of the group, even if their scores now rivaled Ethan's. When the final tallies appeared, the top 5 looked like this. 1. Candidate number 99, attack value 98. 2. Candidate number 234, attack value 97. 3. Candidate number 67, attack value 95. 4. Candidate number 156, attack value 93. 5. Candidate number 279, attack value 90. According to Viper, the instructor nicknamed the poisonous snake, anyone in the top 10 earned a flat 100 points. There was no extra bonus for first or second place. You were simply among the elite. Once the rankings were announced, each participant received one of the Rocket's R belts. Embossed with the team's R emblem, the belt served as both an ID and a digital scorecard. Your candidate number and points balance were encoded on its surface. Even more practical, the belt incorporated a small, cube-shaped storage pocket, perfect for stowing training supplies or personal effects during exercises. Ethan slipped his new belt around his waist, feeling the familiar weight of possibility settle against him. Around him, the others did the same, excitement and competition mingling in the dusty training yard. Guga, belt securely fastened, shot Ethan a scornful glance. No matter how high the newcomer's scores climbed, the old guard would never accept him. Unless, of course, he kept proving them wrong. Ethan brushed aside the protests of the other Rockets, swung himself onto his Dark Crow, and flew straight to the Team Rocket point exchange. Anyone who's ever been a Rocket member knows how vast their points catalog is, from everyday potions to legendary summons. Now that he had points to spend, he faced a simple truth. Points themselves weren't what he needed most. He'd already studied the price list. A quasi-god dragon cub cost 10 million points. A quasi-god Bira cub? Another 10 million. With only 100 points in his account, those high-end summons were laughably out of reach. He rolled his eyes, skipped past the flashy but unattainable items, and navigated to the section where his modest balance would actually matter. Props. There it was, the tree fruit exchange. Every variety, from the common berries to the exotic Majo Navarro fruit, sat waiting to be redeemed. Most trainers ignored these humble fruits, but Ethan knew their true value. Each one carried a unique boost: healing, stamina restoration, even temporary stat enhancements, vital for the challenges ahead. With a satisfied nod, he spent every last point securing a full assortment of tree fruits. Sometimes the simplest tools make all the difference. Ethan glanced down at the fruits filling every cube of his rocket belt's storage. Thanks to his Dark Crow Elf's growth bonus, these rare tree fruits had matured to perfection, and he'd collected one of each variety in a single go, spending just 80 points. He'd then used another 5 points to redeem basic supplies and a few outdoor essentials. After swiping his points card, he turned to leave the exchange booth, only to spot someone ahead carrying an abersnake toward the clerk. As the man passed, Ethan discreetly activated the scanner built into his chip. Puppet Elf, abersnake, green rarity, gender, male, level 14, attribute poison, characteristic intimidation equipped items, none. Genetic skills, chase, poison fang, phantom face. Basic skills, knot binds, poison needle, bite, snake stare, teaching skill, robbery skill. Learner, none. Ethan's eyes narrowed. No wonder this green rank abersnake had carried Guga to first place last time. Green rank elves of this quality were nearly extinct. Few trainers ever laid claim to more than 5 in their entire careers. Recognizing the snake's pedigree, Ethan's step sped back. Guga's reputation was well earned, and this encounter might yet prove interesting. Among the elves who've earned green qualifications, there are supersonic bats and roaming grasswalkers, but only Guga has truly mastered that rank. Everyone knows wild ubbo snakes are nearly impossible to tame, and one blessed both with green status and fierce abilities like this is beyond the reach of ordinary trainers. It was no surprise, then, that Guga had claimed first place before. "Hey!" Guga called, coming to an abrupt halt. "You're up second." Ethan didn't even glance back. He strode forward with calm assurance. Last time he'd been winded and struggling, but now, in his own eyes, he was ready for anything. Guga's smile vanished. Anger flared across his face. "Don't get cocky," he snarled. "Abo snake, attack! Poison needles!" At his command, the massive serpent reared, its jaws snapping open. Several slender spines, glowing with a sickly purple light, shot toward Ethan in a deadly volley. Ethan didn't break stride or look over his shoulder, but he kept his gaze locked on Guga, reading every move. "Prepare to meet your end," Guga jeered, certain that victory was already his. "Murkrow, whip up a tailwind and fire Poison Sting." As Arbok lunged forward, Ethan, already braced for the attack, barked out his command. With a fierce beat of its wings, Murkrow called forth a rushing gust of air, expertly amplifying its own wind techniques. In the slipstream, 2 mini cyclones spun into being, sweeping aside Arbok's poisoned needles before they could find their mark. Ethan stole a glance at Guga. A flash of challenge flickered in his eyes, but Guga only flashed a pleased grin. "Not bad," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Honestly, better than I expected." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strolled over to the trade counter, ignoring Ethan completely. Ethan frowned as Guga's broad shoulders disappeared behind the service desk. He stifled the urge to call him back, instead signaling Murkrow to stand down. The bird alighted gracefully on Ethan's shoulder, and together they slipped out of the exchange hall. Neither looked back. They simply headed straight into the sheltering shadows of the forest. Deep within the massive headquarters at the heart of the base, inside the office of Team Rocket's chief instructor, Arbok lay coiled atop the polished mahogany desk, its unblinking gaze fixed on the closed doors, waiting. Ethan sat across from the hooded man, known only as the Serpent. Between them, 2 porcelain cups of tea sent up spirals of steam that curled and vanished into the still air. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, the Serpent leaned forward, his voice laced with mockery. "So you've come back to me. What's the matter this time?" Under the black hood, a pair of weathered eyes glinted. Ethan drew a slow breath. "The mission failed. I need to recruit a few more people for my team." A low chuckle rumbled from beneath the Serpent's cloak. He lifted one cup, sipped thoughtfully, then set it down with deliberate care. "Failed?" he echoed. "I never expected the famous Ethan would ever miss a target." He let the words hang, tipping his head. "Now you're forced to turn to me for help? Surely there were candidates in the rockets you preferred?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he met the Serpent's gaze without flinching. Outside, the world pressed in, danger always lurking just beyond the calm of the teacups. Inside this tent, alliances were fragile and favors carried a price. With every second that passed, Ethan knew he was gambling on the Serpent's next words. In the dimly lit chamber, Ethan sat draped in black robes, the single candle on the stone table casting flickering shadows across his face. He ignored the Serpent's venomous tone and, after a moment's silence, spoke in a low, hoarse voice. "You walked straight into the Alliance's trap. 2 heaven-rank experts fell on you. You only just managed to escape." The Serpent's sinuous form stiffened. Even a single heaven-rank warrior could devastate most opponents. 2 of them operating together was almost unthinkable. Ethan leaned forward, fingertips brushing the ancient tome open in his lap. "Tell me," he murmured, "was the ambush above ground or underground? And how did you slip away?" The Serpent hissed its displeasure, narrowing its eyes. Sending not 1 but 2 Uranus-ranked champions against a single target spoke volumes about the Elf Alliance's intentions. Whatever they were planning must be monumental. Across the silent chamber, the candle's flame quivered. At last, Ethan rolled back his left sleeve and revealed a shriveled, gnarled hand, its skin like dry parchment. The Serpent recoiled as though struck. In that instant, it understood precisely why Ethan wore the black robes, and why no mere 2 heaven-rank warriors were enough to stop him. Ethan stared at his left hand, gaunt, withered, and missing 3 fingers. Only his thumb and forefinger remained. At his age, it should have healed already, yet the wound looked fresh. From the shadows, the black-robed figure spoke in a low, hoarse voice edged with frost. "Poison Sovereign?" he asked, though his tone sounded more like affirmation than a question. "Only a high-tier Poison Sovereign, or at most a mid-tier Force Sovereign, could inflict damage like this. Neither walks among the Alliance's known champions. Ethan drew a steadying breath, forcing his racing heart to calm. If he hadn't reacted swiftly enough to sever 3 of his own fingers, he would have lost the entire hand. Thanks to the timely assistance of the 3 elves, he'd managed to pull clear. All that remained was this grievous stump. Without their help, he'd be lying out there, and the mission would have ended in total failure. Chapter 7. Leaving the base. Ethan nodded gravely. The Alliance had just sent 2 Uranus-class masters to escort him, one of them a legendary senior titan, an exceptionally rare rank. They must have uncovered more about the mission's true scope, otherwise they wouldn't have committed such high-level forces. Although Ethan understood only fragments of the operation, he sensed it was far more delicate and dangerous than anyone had let on. A man in flowing black robes approached, his face hidden beneath a deep hood. Ethan cleared his throat. "Where is the commander now?" The cloaked figure lowered his left hand and replied evenly, "Our commander already knows who betrayed us. Internal security is under control. No need for you to worry about leaks anymore. What I need at the moment is a few skilled operatives to help me with a critical task. I've expended a great deal of energy and must recover before the trial begins." Ethan allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. Assigning a handful of agents would be no issue. Even the rocket squad has been drained, so they're hardly needed right now. He raised an eyebrow. "Do you want your team assembled immediately or after the trial?" The black-robed man's lips curved in a thin smile. "After the trial, send a small detachment to my quarters. For now, prepare a secure chamber where I can rest and recuperate." Without another word, he turned on his heel and drifted away down the corridor, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the unsettling certainty that whatever lay ahead would test them all to their limits. The Viper refused to recruit directly from the League's existing ranks. For one thing, it was impossible to know which soldiers could be trusted and which might be undercover agents. For another, raw recruits, blank slates, are far easier to shape than battle-scarred veterans. After dismissing his black-robed agents, the Viper stared into the trembling candlelight on the table, folded his hands, and sank into thought. A short while later, Ao reported that Ethan had slipped into the forest, the dark crow perched on his shoulder. He had no intention of remaining at the wooded fringe. The scattered elves there were too weak to serve as effective training partners for his familiar. More importantly, Ethan needed a secluded spot where he could set up camp and concentrate on forging new energy blocks. As he ventured deeper, the beaten path faded away beneath thick undergrowth. Slipping the energy cube he'd crafted earlier into the hidden compartment of his belt, he adjusted the cloth wrapped around his head to keep stray thorns and branches from scratching his face. Then, with only the distant caw of his raven and the hush of the trees for company, he pressed on. Ethan picked his way through the gathering shadows of the forest, the narrow trail winding beneath towering pines and tangled underbrush. Perched on his shoulder, the dark-feathered crow flared its wings and summoned a gentle breeze. Grass and low branches swayed aside, clearing Ethan's path. When a thick limb blocked their way, the crow beat its wings harder, sending a focused gust that cracked the wood in two, an unrefined exercise in its fledgling wind magic. "Good," Ethan murmured, slowing his pace to study his companion. "But don't overdo it. You need to conserve your energy. Physical endurance has always been your weak point." He rested a hand over his heart, then swept it toward the crow. "From now on, every time you use wind power, you'll monitor your output. Use only what's necessary." The crow cocked its head, its coal-black eyes bright with understanding. Ethan continued, "And remember, you're not just a wind elf. You're also aligned with the dark arts. Once we find a safe clearing, we'll begin targeted training for your shadow magic. Strength in both elements will be crucial." A sharp "gah" came from the bird as it bobbed with excitement. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. The crow's eagerness matched his own hunger for power and mastery. Together they pressed deeper into the forest, mentor and disciple ready to hone the gifts that bound them. Ethan watched as Dark Crow's onyx wings swept outward, sending twin whirlwinds spiraling through the clearing. He felt a surge of relief. In the life of a trainer, Raw talent is worthless without the will to grow. A spirit born with modest gifts but driven by ambition will often surpass one with greater natural aptitude, but no fighting heart. Dark Crow may have been undersized in natural talent, but its determination and the bond it shared with Ethan had only grown stronger. With that hunger to improve, there was no limit to what they could achieve together. Before he could savor the moment, Ethan's thoughts were shattered by a sudden shadow overhead. A massive wild sparrow dove from the treetops, its fierce amber eyes locked on him. Razor-sharp beak and talons glinted in the sunlight, and every muscle in its feathered body tensed for the kill. The island's spirits, among them many bird and beast-like forms, were notoriously hostile to humans. They treated any trespasser as prey, as casually as if they were snatching a tender sapling from the earth. This particular sparrow was infamous for its aggression, yet its dive felt almost routine to Ethan. With a single fluid step, he shifted his weight and let the bird's claws slice harmlessly past him. The attack missed by inches, and Ethan landed lightly on the forest floor, ready for whatever came next. In this world, it wasn't unusual for elves to ambush humans, and the wounds dealt by powerful elf beasts were often sudden and lethal. Worse still, some ruthless organizations kept elves on leash, sending them to slaughter at a moment's notice. The Rockets were among the most notorious. They pursued every contract with single-minded brutality, caring nothing for justice or mercy. Even within the League, their methods drew disgusted whispers. Ethan had clawed his way to the head of a city garrison under the Rockets' banner, earning a reputation for near-kingly combat skill. He'd weathered dozens of deadly surprises like today's, so when a flock of sparrow-like elf creatures swooped in, he scarcely broke his rhythm. A great wingtip slashed toward him. He pivoted on a heel, and the blade whooshed past. "Dark Crow," he called, voice calm. "Assume wind stance and deliver the wraith blow." At his command, the raven-black familiar beat its wings and soared, wind whirling in its wake. The Dark Crow harbored no fondness for these sparrow elves. They'd nearly wounded Ethan a heartbeat ago, and the insult stung its pride. Had his master been less nimble, they would have dealt a grievous injury. Now, as Ethan's devoted elf, it was the crow's honor, and its fury, to strike back. A black shape streaked past, its momentum carried by a sudden tailwind, and struck the strong sparrow with a surprise attack. "Kya!" The sparrow shrieked as it was hurled backward through the air. In that instant, Ethan took the opportunity to scan its data. Pokémon, strong sparrow, type normal flying. Ability, keen eye level 12, gender male. Held item, none. Basic moves, peck, growl, leer, pursuit. Drelk egg moves, none. Taunt moves, none. An orange tier wild Pokémon, respectable, Ethan thought. But by launching that initial strike, the sparrow had left itself dangerously exposed. "Dark Crow, don't let up, peck it again," he ordered, his voice calm and steady. The Dark Crow needed no further prompting. It beat its wings, swooped in, and rammed the sparrow with a second rapid peck. Caught off guard and already weakened by the first hit, the sparrow couldn't mount a counterattack. It paid the price for its bold aggression, tumbling out of the sky as Dark Crow hovered triumphantly overhead. Ethan didn't linger over the sparrow his Dark Crow had torn apart. He pressed on into the forest's shadowed depths. Spriggans, an elven folk famed for their strength, typically travel in packs, and he had no wish to tangle with a whole band today. He knew that, deeper in, the elves would only grow more powerful. Better to conserve his energy and simply find a safe campsite. Drawing on memories of living off the land in his previous life, Ethan threaded narrow game trails and used subtle animal tracking tricks to steer clear of the mightiest elves. A few curious Spriggans had lunged at him, but he and his Dark Crow dispatched them swiftly and quietly, then slipped away before more could gather. 3 hours later, Ethan at last found what he'd been hunting, a small, secluded lake cradled by dense evergreens. On its western shore, a gentle slope rose to a rocky ridge where a shallow cave, undoubtedly carved by elves, offered immediate shelter. He let the Dark Crow circle overhead once, ensuring no unseen watchers, then nodded with satisfaction. This will do nicely. Ethan set down his pack, scanned the rim of trees for any movement, and drew a slow, contented breath. Here at last he could rest, at least until tomorrow's journey called him onward. Chapter 8. Supersonic Bat Cave. The sun hovered low over the lake, its fading light scattering in golden ripples across the water. A cool breeze stirred the surface, sending shimmering waves dancing toward the rocky shore. Ethan moved forward with measured steps, the dark crow perched vigilantly on his shoulder. A sudden, acrid scent rode the wind. Ethan's nose twitched, and the crow instinctively lifted a wing to cover its beak. Each step toward the cave's mouth intensified the foul odor, yet neither man nor bird faltered. The cavern gaped before them, its entrance a yawning void of pitch-black rock. Deep scratches scored the walls, clearly not the work of natural erosion but of something, or someone, with powerful claws. Ethan crouched to study the marks more closely. "This place was carved out long ago," he murmured. "Let's just hope we don't find a powerful elf inside." The crow's feathers ruffled as its muscles tensed beneath the slick plumage, air humming with anticipation. Ethan took a steadying breath, tightened his grip on his lantern, and stepped into the darkness of the supersonic bat cave. Ethan smiled reassuringly at the anxious dark crow. "It's all right. Let's see what's inside first." As the crow began to calm, Ethan stooped, picked up a jagged piece of rubble at his feet, weighed it in his hand, and then gave a sharp nod. He hurled the stone into the mouth of the cave. Thud, thud, thud. After a few echoes, everything fell silent. Then came a faint hiss, followed by the tremble of beating wings. Ethan, who had already stepped back out of the cave's entrance, felt his tension ease. As long as it wasn't some overpowered elf, or worse, he was confident Dark Crow could handle whatever lay ahead. Suddenly, a dozen ultrasonic bats hurtled out of the darkness, their red eyes glowing with feral anger. Like all wild bats, they slept by day and hunted by night. Now, roused from their slumber, they swooped chaotically, disoriented and irritable. Among them, one bat towered above the rest, its wingspan nearly twice that of the others. Clearly, this massive creature was their leader. Ethan's torchlight quivered across the cavern walls, and dozens of red eyes glowed back at him. He and his companion, an elf scout, had stumbled upon the lair of the supersonic bats, accidentally rousing them from slumber. In an instant, the chieftain bat let out a chilling screech that summoned 4 of its most powerful kin from the shadows. The rest slipped away, retreating to deeper recesses of the cave. Ethan watched, momentarily taken aback. He remembered that there had once been over a dozen of these creatures here. Confronting even a single red-tier supersonic bat was no small feat, much less 4. Yet the leader's arrogant disdain, those narrowed eyes that seemed to mock his intrusion, weighed on him more heavily than their numbers. As the quartet of bats launched itself into the air, fangs bared and wings beating like thunderclaps, Ethan cracked a confident smile. He tapped his data chip, scanning their profiles in a fraction of a second. 4 red-tier supersonic bats, highest level 10, he murmured. Beside him, the dark crow spread its midnight black wings. In 2 days of relentless training, the bird had not only recovered its latent power, but had grown to love the dance of battle. Now it dove and weaved around the charging bats with the grace of a swirling gale, fluid, unpredictable, and deadly, drawing the enemies into Ethan's perfect ambush. Dark Crow, circle downwind, then use fright. Ethan's command cut through the evening air. A rushing current coalesced around the Dark Crow, its feathers shimmering with inky black light against the sunset sky. The crow's beak snapped open, unleashing a piercing cry that rippled outward like a shockwave. Caught in the blast, the 2 supersonic bats faltered in mid-flight. Their leathery wings twitched as they struggled to stay aloft, faces twisted in alarm. Though these bats possessed strong mental defenses, their hypersensitive ears made them dreadfully vulnerable to such a shrill ult, one that not only rattled their nerves, but threw their echolocation into chaos. Regaining what composure they could, the bats exchanged a quick glance and emitted faint, inaudible pulses. Ethan felt the subtle tremor of those ultrasonic waves brush against him, an unsettling interference that he fought to ignore. "Dark Crow, full speed. Take them down," he ordered, voice steady. With a powerful beat of its wings, the crow surged forward, talons outstretched and eyes glowing, ready to finish the job. Ethan watched intently as the air around his Dark Crow began to whirl into a fierce gale, closing in on the circle of supersonic bats above. "Peck!" he commanded. In an instant, the Dark Crow plummeted at supersonic speed. Its beak flashed twice in rapid succession. 2 bats tumbled from the sky, lifeless before they hit the ground. Without losing momentum, the crow launched a third searing peck, cutting down 2 more in midair. Only 2 bats remained, and they'd been frozen solid with terror. As the wind died away, they blinked back to reality, horrified at the sight of 4 fallen comrades. Their wings trembled, uncertain whether to press the attack or flee. A smug smile tugged at Ethan's lips. While his enemies hesitated, he was already planning his next move. Ethan stood in the moonlit clearing, surrounded by screeching supersonic bats. He raised his hand and called out with authority. "Dark Raven! Punishment! Hit them all at once!" Dark Raven's eyes glowed as it tapped into its dark transformation. Thanks to its trickster's heart, change-type moves always take precedence, and under Ethan's lingering blessing, this one was unstoppable. A bolt of inky energy streaked from its wings, slicing through 2 of the bats in mid-flight. They collapsed, lifeless, on the forest floor. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Dark Raven wasn't fully recovered yet, but its innate mischief talent made every transformation move blisteringly fast. Combined with its steadily improving tailwind technique and the seamless flow between skills, now that it had earned its green rank, the combo was devastating. A chorus of frantic wing beats filled the air as the remaining bats circled for another strike. Spotting their lumbering leader, his arrogance slowing his reflexes, Ethan seized the moment. "Now!" he shouted. Dark Raven surged forward, first whipping up a tailwind gale that knocked the lesser bats off balance, then pivoting midair into a second punishment. One by one, the creatures plummeted, unable to withstand the Raven's onslaught. In the end, only the supersonic bat leader remained, wings tattered and breaths coming ragged. He glared up at Ethan with a furious snarl that echoed through the silent woods. The rest were vanquished. Victory belonged to Ethan and his indomitable Dark Raven. Ethan crouched behind a broken stone pillar, his eyes locked on the creature hovering before him. On his scanner's display flashed the stats of the wild elf he'd never seen in the yellow tier. Name, ultrasonic bat, yellow. Gender, male. Level, 12. Attributes, poison, flight. Characteristic, mental power. Genetic skill, flash of electricity. Basic skills, suck, ultrasonic, scare, bite. Teachable skill, wing attack. No trainer had claimed him yet. If Ethan had an extra elven ball in his pack, he would have tossed it without hesitation. This bat could be a formidable ally, or at the very least, a valuable bargaining chip. Behind Ethan, his puppet spirit, the Dark Crow, struggled to stay aloft. At the start of the skirmish, its powerful tailwind had whipped the air into a gale, but now each wing beat grew slower, the gusts thinning almost to nothing. Ethan frowned at his puppet's exhaustion. Despite his best will, the crow was nearing its limit. Across the clearing, the ultrasonic bat let out a high-pitched screech, its wings quivering with barely contained rage. Ethan knew there was no choice but to press on. He'd considered calling the Dark Crow back for a breather, but the sun was dipping below the horizon. Once darkness fell, the forest would grow even more treacherous, and this fight had to be resolved before then. Steeling himself, Ethan tightened his grip on the control orb. The next move would decide everything. At night, supersonic bats are at the height of their power. In the pitch-black forests, they depend on echolocation alone, so they're unhindered by darkness, while Ethan and the Dark Crow, both reliant on vision, see their combat effectiveness drop whenever they're forced into the shadows. Our best move is clear. Take out the yellow tier bat, basking near the sunlit cave entrance, then claim its foul-smelling roost for ourselves. Remember, a forest under cover of night is far more dangerous than its daylight perimeter. Once you leave the safety of the edge and press inward, threats lie hidden around every tree. Chapter 9. Clash with the Supersonic Bat Commander. Ethan stretched out a hand and murmured, "Hold on, Dark Crow. Ride the wind." The massive black bird flapped its ragged wings, its screech, "Gah!" echoing through the dusk sky. Despite its exhaustion, Dark Crow radiated exhilaration. Today's battle, especially against a supersonic bat leader so far superior to any of their previous foes, had thrilled the creature beyond measure. Seeing the fierce joy in his companion's eyes, Ethan allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Below them, the bat leader let out a chilling hiss. Night was falling, and with each passing moment, its cruel intellect seemed to sharpen. Narrow, bloodless eyes fixed on the slender human and the elf by his side, these two had scattered his forces, leaving him the sole commander of an empty sky. The sunset's last rays only fueled his savage strength. Without warning, the bat's leathery wings quivered, and it lunged forward. From between its fanged jaws slithered a wispy tendril of black vapor. Those twin dagger-sharp fangs glinted with malignant light as it bore down on Ethan and Dark Crow. A sinister whisper rippled across the clearing. "Bite! Evil skill!" Ethan's heart pounded. He drew himself up on Dark Crow's back, meeting the creature's predatory advance head-on. The final confrontation was at hand. Ethan stood perfectly still, his heart as calm as a mountain lake, even as the winged leader of the supersonic bats zeroed in on him. In that instant, Dark Crow, his steadfast companion, dropped into a low dive and harnessed the tailwind's final surge of speed. In a heartbeat, the black-feathered avian shot past Ethan and positioned itself directly between him and their enemy. With a crack like a gunshot, Dark Crow flattened into a bullet of shadow and slammed into the bat leader. The two beasts rolled end over end through the night sky, trading savage blows with claw and beak. They separated only briefly before hurtling back into one another. Without the full force of the tailwind to buoy it, Dark Crow lost a fraction of its momentum, but it still outpaced the bat in raw agility. The ultrasonic swarm tried to encircle the dark bird, cutting off Ethan's only line of defense, but Dark Crow twisted through the air, weaving a cage of wings around its foes. As darkness deepened, the bats seemed to draw strength from the night itself. Their screeches grew louder, their attacks more frenzied. Dark Crow's relentless strikes began to falter under the onslaught. On the third brutal collision, the dark bird's wings splayed awkwardly, and it plummeted toward the ground. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Dark Crow hit the earth with a heavy thud and lay still, too weary to rise. Ethan's eyes widened as the leader of the supersonic bat wavered on trembling wings, its gaze fixed on him with predatory hunger. It had taken the worst beating in this fight, its body aching, its energy all but spent. Now it craved blood more than anything. With a sudden screech, the bat lunged, fangs aglow with that dreaded life-draining power. Ethan braced himself, but at his side, Dark Crow was barely holding on. The crow's wings fluttered unevenly, its chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. It looked battered, an agonizing sight for any trainer. As a trainer's elf, nothing cut deeper than feeling powerless to protect the one you cared about. But then Dark Crow caught sight of Ethan, resolute, standing firm even as the bat's power swirled toward him. A flicker of defiance sparked in the crow's eyes. "Dark Crow, hang in there! Use snatch!" Ethan shouted. The crow let out a raspy croak. Digging deep, it found a reserve of strength, flaring its shadowy wings in a sudden fierce burst of energy. Just as the supersonic bat's fangs closed around Ethan's arm, draining his life force, Dark Crow acted. In a blur of motion, it reached through the bat's attack, snatching the life drain technique itself. The supersonic bat halted mid-lunge, its fangs falling slack. Stripped of its hunger-stealing power, it staggered back, drained and powerless. All it could do now was stare, bloodlust turning to disbelief, as Dark Crow steadied itself beside Ethan once more. Ethan waited, coiled like a spring, as the supersonic bat leader lunged. When its razor-sharp fangs sank into his flank, he braced for the usual agony, yet also for the hidden benefit that always followed a true blood feast. To his captor's surprise, however, no warm crimson flow filled its maw, and no flood of revitalizing power surged through its veins. It was as if one had reached out for an ice cream cone on a scorching afternoon, only to grasp at thin air. The bat leader staggered back, bewildered. Not only had it failed to regain strength, but it was actually growing weaker. All the while, Ethan, his body cloaked in sleek midnight feathers, felt a comforting warmth spreading from the puncture wound. Every fiber of exhaustion melted away, as though a parched desert had finally drunk its fill. Desperation flickered in the bat's crimson eyes as it twisted mid-flight, its wings trembling with sudden fatigue. Too late, it realized Ethan's hidden advantage. The moment its blood siphon would have kicked in, Ethan's system skill, theft, empowered by his Heart of Mischief attribute, activated instead. Faster than the bat could react, the stolen healing surged back into Ethan, leaving the supersonic predator drained and disoriented, while Ethan soared away renewed. "Dark Crow, use Feather Perch," Ethan called, seizing on the supersonic bat leader's momentary weakness. With a powerful flap, Dark Crow descended to the ground, talons stirring the earth. A warm surge of energy flowed up through his limbs, and in an instant he regained half his stamina. As Dark Crow touched down, Ethan barked his next commands. Now, Tailwind, then unleash a continuous Pex barrage. Finish him off. The Bat Leader barely had time to react. One moment he hovered in the moonlit sky. The next, a shadowy form, Dark Crow, was upon him. The creature's obsidian beak glinted as it struck, blow after blow, carving fresh wounds across the leader's wings and torso. The bat staggered, its strength draining with every merciless peck, but it was too exhausted to mount any defense. Within seconds, the relentless onslaught broke the supersonic bat leader's resistance. As he crumpled to the forest floor, Dark Crow stood triumphant. Ethan's swift tactics had prevailed. Caw! The Dark Crow's cry rang out as it stretched its newly strengthened wings. Ethan watched in awe as its feathers shimmered, its talons curled with sharpened precision, and its beak gleamed so brightly it seemed to capture the moonlight itself. After their grueling battle, the bird had finally advanced from level 10 to level 11. It was only a single rank, but in the world of elves, every level gained was a hard-won triumph. With a vigorous shake, the crow's momentum carried it downward. Ethan's brow furrowed in concern. He dashed forward and caught the bird just inches above the ground. Trembling in his arms, the crow showed the telltale signs of having used its feather restoration technique. Ethan knew why it hadn't deployed that skill earlier in the fight. While feather restoration could instantly replenish stamina, it did so by drawing on deep reserves. Overuse risked long-term weakening, even rank regression for an elf. Gently, he lowered the exhausted crow onto a soft patch of grass. From now on, he said quietly, we'll only use feather restoration in true emergencies. No more quick fixes in battle. We'll rely on your strength and growth instead. Ethan was fortunate to have inherited his family's cultivation gift, a talent that let him forge bespoke spirit energy blocks. He kept his Dark Crow technique in reserve. It was powerful for scouting, but even a single use left him drained for hours. Tonight, with the crow's energy nearly spent, he chose stealth over spectacle. Under a sliver of moonlight, Ethan slipped into the supersonic bat cave. The instant he entered, a sour, fetid odor rose from the glistening walls. He forced himself to breathe steadily, stepping carefully around thick patches of damp, clay-like guano. Every footfall pressed him deeper into the dank tunnel. Faint moonlight revealed deep, jagged scratches gouged into the rock, identical to the marks outside the entrance. The inference was unmistakable. The bats hadn't carved this lair themselves. They'd simply moved in, taking over an abandoned nest. Whatever creature had once called this cave home had long since perished or fled. Otherwise, the cavern floor wouldn't be blanketed in so many seasons' worth of droppings. Ethan pressed on, counting 10 meters into the earth before the muck underfoot finally dried. There, in the still midnight air of the cave's heart, he paused, every sense alert, ready for whatever lay ahead. High above them, a narrow crack in the cave wall let a sliver of moonlight filter down, casting a faint glow around Ethan. It wasn't as pitch black as the cavern's depths, just enough to trace the rough contours of stone. He leaned back against a dry boulder and carefully cradled Dark Crow in his arms. Tonight, this meager refuge would have to do. After a long, silent moment, Dark Crow began to stir. He ruffled his feathers, then hopped gently out of Ethan's lap. Pressing his beak against Ethan's palm, the bird felt the reassuring warmth of his trainer's hand, and at last, he let out a soft, relieved trill. Sometimes, caring for a Pokémon is as simple as that. No matter how fierce the storm or how dark the night, your chosen partner stays by your side, your most loyal companion and truest friend. Chapter 10. Crafting Energy Blocks. Ethan set the Dark Crow aside and turned his thoughts to the tasks ahead. First on his agenda was to continue feeding the creature those yellow fruit energy cubes. The results over the past few days had been too promising to ignore. In just 4 days, the Dark Crow had gone from a scrawny, malnourished state to the size of a typical Dark Crow elf, nearly 50 centimeters tall. But Ethan knew the transformation ran deeper than mere size. Each day, he ran a precise scan on the embedded chip, watching as the creature's strength, speed, and even its innate talent steadily improved. On the aptitude meter, the indicator still glowed green, yet its hue had darkened considerably since a few days ago, a clear sign that this dark crow's potential ranked among the elite levels of elf spirits. And after today's relentless battle drills, the crow absorbed the energy cubes with noticeably greater efficiency. Time was growing short. Ethan had only 3 days left to finalize his preparations. With the dark crow's progress on track, his next challenge awaited, figuring out how to forge his own energy blocks. Ethan leaned forward, studying the small energy block glowing on the training table. With continued use of these blocks, he was convinced his dark crow would soon regain its original power, and then some. It was time for rapid growth, so there was no question of letting up. Over the next few days, he planned to push its training harder than ever, sending it out to spar with more elves. The more battles it fought, the better it would adapt to the rhythm of combat, and the more efficiently it could absorb each energy block's restorative effects. As for the crow's next focus, speed would be paramount. Ethan resolved to drill its wind-riding maneuvers until they became instinctive. At the same time, he would have it polish its existing moves. Even the skills it had already learned needed hours of repetition before they could be executed with deadly precision. Of course, as a demon of shadow and flight, the dark crow already boasted impressive defenses. Unless it was hit with 4 times normal power, no elf line could restrain it. And though it suffered a double weakness against electric, ice, and fairy elements, such opponents were virtually non-existent on Trial Island. The only real threat came from rock-type attacks, so that would be the one vulnerability Ethan had to watch for in every upcoming battle. Dark crows of the Prankheart lineage already enjoy a natural edge in both offensive burst and supportive blessing skills. All that remains is to take them into battle more often, deepening the bond between trainer and Pokémon, and to refine the techniques they've already learned. Once the current Huanguo energy module is depleted, the Dark Crow will need a fresh energy block to trigger its next growth spurt. Ethan had anticipated this from the start of the first ranking tournament. His target is the Black Velocity module, a mid-grade energy cell characterized by its swirling black and white matrix. According to the specs, it's forged from 2 rare tree fruits, the Evil Fruit and the Swift Fruit, augmented by a dozen other exotic arboreal ingredients. Designed specifically for dark and flying-type spirits, it perfectly complements the Dark Crow's evolutionary path. Knowing how vital this boost would be, Ethan poured nearly all of his ranking points into redeeming vouchers for those 2 fruits, emptying Rocket Island's entire supply. It was a gamble, but once the Black Velocity module is assembled, the Dark Crow is poised to vault into a period of rapid, explosive growth. Ethan lay back against the cool stone, hands clasped behind his head, and watched silvery moonlight spill through a crack high in the cave's ceiling. Beside him, his black crow settled its feathers, each measured breath echoing softly against the walls. The day's battles had worn him down, and before long, Ethan's eyelids drifted closed. By the time dawn broke, the world outside had already begun to stir. Pale sunlight slanted through the same fissure, dancing across Ethan's face and gently nudging him awake. Summer mornings here were unforgivingly early, but yesterday's fierce fighting had kept him from rising at first light. Gradually, though, the warmth on his skin and the soft rustle of the crow rousing itself loosened the last tensions in his body. He stretched arms over his head, feeling the satisfying lengthen of tired muscles. Across from him, the crow blinked awake, ruffling its glossy wings and letting out a low caw. Ethan couldn't help smiling. In his former life, after attaining the rank of Heavenly King, he'd grown complacent, always on edge one moment, indulging himself the next. Now, starting over in this strange land, he'd finally found a steady rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at ease. Ethan stood at the mouth of the cavern, his arms folded as he surveyed the dim interior. "Dark Raven," he called. "Today's mission is simple. Keep flapping your wings until every trace of odor in this cave has vanished." In their recent battles, Raven had barely tapped into its wind-based abilities, mostly just downdraft techniques. Ethan was confident that with regular practice, Raven would not only perfect those basic skills, but could even learn advanced storms well before most other wyverns. And as an added bonus, the constant wing beating would clear away the foul smell and leave their lair sparkling. 2 goals, 1 training session. Grah! Dark Raven responded with a fierce cry, nodding in eager agreement. Since the moment it hatched on the rugged slopes of Rocket Ridge, Raven had known only hardship. It had never met its parents, had lived without proper food or shelter, and suffered the taunts of its peers. Until Ethan arrived, Raven had never felt kindness. That single act of compassion had forged an unbreakable bond. Ethan was not just its trainer, but the only figure Raven could think of as family. With careful precision, Raven launched into a steady flurry of wing beats, determined to live up to Ethan's faith and never let him down. Ethan smiled as he watched his dark crow's excitement. From his storage pouch, he withdrew the day's ration of Huanguo energy cubes. The crow's small eyes gleamed with anticipation as Ethan tossed the cubes, one by one, into the air. Each cube was snatched up and swallowed in a single eager bite. A satisfied burp rumbled in the crow's throat. It flapped its broad wings and glided deeper into the cave, stirring up a playful gust that whistled through the cavern. Ethan, positioned just behind his companion, felt no chill from the sudden breeze. Stepping over to the pool, fed by an underground spring, Ethan cupped his hands and splashed cool water on his face. He chewed thoughtfully on a piece of dried jerky, then knelt on a flat stone to prepare the rest of his meal. From his pouch, he produced a handful of wild fruits and dried herbs, arranging them neatly on a nearby ledge. He selected one of the firmer, tangiest fruits first. With practiced care, he scrubbed each fruit against the smooth stone, rinsing them under a trickle of spring water. He then washed his wooden mortar and pestle before setting to work grinding the fruits and herbs into a fragrant mash. It made perfect sense why the cave's original owner had chosen this spot. Hidden springs bubbled just beneath the floor, and the cavern mouth opened onto a quiet lakeshore. For Ethan and his loyal dark crow, it was an ideal refuge, secluded, stocked with fresh water, and surprisingly affordable to occupy. Ethan's makeshift workshop sat just above an underground spring whose water was clearer and sweeter than anything the elves drew from the lake. With no metal or glass tools at his disposal, he'd crafted everything out of wood, pots and mortars, hand-cranked impurity separators, a simple piston compressor, even a rudimentary condenser. The process was laborious and slow, each energy block taking hours of grinding, pressing, and distilling, but the quality was surprisingly good. More advanced blocks, with their intricate crystalline lattices, lay beyond the reach of such crude gear. Today, Ethan set to work preparing the raw ingredients. Using a keen blade, he carefully peeled and pitted every fruit, then, with the help of a small calculation chip mounted on his cutting board, sliced each piece into perfectly uniform cubes. Next came the medicinal roots and barks. He trimmed away all woody or discolored sections, then pounded them into a fine pulp to ensure no grit remained. Once his materials were ready, Ethan began the blending stage. First, he added the freshly chopped flesh of the quick fruit to the rocker mixer, pulsing it until the pieces turned into a smooth, vibrant slurry. Then, following the step-by-step instructions stored on his chip, he introduced the other tree fruits, sunberry, shadow lemon, and wind pear, in precise order and quantity, followed by carefully measured doses of the powdered herbs. Each addition was stirred thoroughly before the next went in, ensuring a perfectly homogeneous mixture ready for compression into solid energy blocks. Ethan worked with methodical precision. Each ingredient had to be measured to the exact milligram, stirred at a precise speed for an exact duration, and added in a strict sequence. Such exacting requirements meant only a handful of technicians in the Alliance could turn out energy blocks efficiently. Fortunately, Ethan's custom microchips handled every variable. He simply loaded the recipe and let the system run. He poured the pre-mixed energy juice into a cooled molding chamber. Once the automated sequence had compressed and coagulated the contents, he transferred the chamber to a refrigerated curing bay and waited. When the first block emerged fully formed, he set it aside, emptied the chamber, and began assembling fresh ingredients for the next cycle. Chapter 11. Taste. All morning, Darkcrow had been working on his wing strength and perfecting his air blast technique, everything Ethan had outlined in the flight training plan. Whenever the magnificent black creature's wings tired, he'd pause for a breather, then dive right back into the regimen. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed beside the makeshift workbench inside the cave, hammering out energy cubes. These new creations were far more intricate than the simple Huangguo blocks he'd made before, but with only basic tools at his disposal, he somehow managed to churn out over 100 before noon. Now he stood, rubbing the pins and needles from his legs and surveying rows of neatly packed cubes in their containers. A satisfied exhale escaped him. "All right, Dark Crow," Ethan called. "That's enough for today. Let's take 5. Lunch is up next."
Ka!
Crow cried in agreement, giving his massive wings a final, triumphant flap. At the sound, a half-dozen tiny whirlwind sprites swirled into view at the cave's mouth, whisking away the hard-packed bat guano that had gathered overnight. Once they'd done their job, the little twisters darted back in a line and alighted on Ethan's shoulder with cheerful chirps. Ethan nearly lost his balance under the sudden weight, his legs still trembling from hours hunched on the floor. He steadied himself with a laugh. Okay, I'm coming," he said, leading Crow toward the fire pit where lunch would soon be waiting. Ethan looked at the Dark Crow, now blinking at him with an almost bashful expression. He reached out and ran his fingers through its sleek feathers, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he murmured. "My body's regained its strength, but I don't think I can carry you much farther." In truth, humans in this elven realm often outmatched their counterparts back on Earth in sheer physical resilience. Although Ethan himself remained on the slender side, he felt no strain supporting the crow's weight, at least not yet. He'd heard tales of other humans whose bodies were every bit as hardy as those of ordinary elves. Some devoted themselves to martial training so rigorously that they could go toe-to-toe with elven fighters. The most famous example, in Ethan's mind, was Xiba, the Fighting King, one of the legendary 4 kings of Kanto in the years to come. Legend held that Xiba's strength and endurance rivaled even Howley, the greatest of the elf warriors. Then there were those blessed with rare talents, like the master of the Taoist Pavilion in Golden City, Kanto. Known simply as Nazi, he was a prodigy whose power surpassed that of most super-elves. In addition, Nazi held one of the top 3 posts in the Rockets, making him a force both feared and respected throughout the realm. Ethan straightened, slipping a reassuring hand beneath the crow's breast. "Hold on a little longer," he said softly. "We'll find a safe place to rest soon." And with that, he resumed his steady pace across the forest floor, the ebony bird perched securely on his shoulder, wings folded in quiet trust. Ethan had faced Nashi once in his previous life, and the memory still filled him with pride. So whenever he trained the Dark Crow, he made sure to push himself as well. He didn't need to match Naji's legendary strength, but he refused to become a burden to his elves. Living by the lake had its perks, especially at lunchtime. In these unspoiled waters, fish teemed everywhere. After several clumsy attempts, the Dark Crow finally mastered the art of fishing. Before long, he'd caught more than enough to satisfy their hunger. They returned to Ethan's lakeside camp, where he seasoned the fresh catch and grilled it over a crackling fire. The aroma of smoky fish drifted through the air as man and elf sat down to a simple, hearty meal. Their break went by all too quickly. Stretching, Ethan rose and brushed crumbs from his tunic. "All right," he said, glancing at the sun. "Lunch break's almost over. This afternoon it's all battle drills. Ready, Dark Crow?" "Gah!" the Dark Crow squawked, flapping Hyssop's wings in obvious excitement. The morning's training had already made him stronger, but nothing fired him up like the promise of a good fight. Ethan smiled and patted the Dark Crow's head. "You're a true warrior, my friend." Ethan pressed deeper into the forest, alert to every broken twig and scuff of cloak. Wild elves prowled these woods in droves, but with the neural chip implanted at his temple, he could scan an enemy's vital data in an instant. If a target seemed too strong, he slipped away without a trace. If the numbers looked just right, he unleashed his companion, Dark Raven, to finish the fight. By late afternoon, Ethan and Dark Raven had dispatched half a dozen elves that challenged them. In this realm, neither Ethan's unassuming frame nor Dark Raven's sleek, shadowy form raised suspicion. They looked like any other travelers. Yet time and again, the two proved unbeatable. When the sun dipped low enough to turn the treetops silver, Ethan, bones weary and muscles humming with fatigue, led Dark Raven back to the cave he'd carved into the mountainside. Inside, the raven perched on a jagged stalactite, preening its wings. Ethan slipped out his exercise mat and began his nightly regimen. Ever since he'd started feeding on the energy cubes harvested from defeated elves, his once frail body had grown stronger. Night by night, diligent calisthenics filled in the hollows of his thin frame, lean muscle coiled beneath his skin, definition traced across his arms and torso. When he finished, Ethan lay back and unscrewed the lid of a small container. Inside sat black and white cubes of condensed energy, each one a translucent jelly-like block. Their surfaces gleamed without a single fleck of impurity. He drew his blade, sliced off a sliver of one cube, and let it dissolve on his tongue. A warm pulse spread from his stomach to his limbs, fuel for tomorrow's hunt. Satisfied, Ethan closed his eyes, already planning which trail to follow at dawn. Ethan popped a small energy cube into his mouth. A dry, slightly bitter flavor exploded on his tongue, harsh herbal notes mingling with faint hints of dried forest fruit. Only someone with an exceptionally trained palate could tease out all the ingredients or appreciate the complicated elven production process. He winced, but he knew this was exactly the taste an elf would crave. Almost immediately, warmth spread through his aching muscles, easing the fatigue that had settled into his bones. This was the effect of the human-formulated cube. The specially calibrated elven version would be even more potent. He slipped the remaining cubes into the storage compartment of his rocket belt and glanced at Dark Crow. The sleek, raven-like creature eyed him eagerly, its head tilted. Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "You greedy bird," he teased, reaching back into his belt. He pulled out 2 golden fruit energy cubes, stronger, richer bars designed for maximum recovery, and held them out. Dark Crow let out an excited caw, its feathers ruffling. "Here, don't think I'll let you have anything else until you've polished these off." Ethan watched the last of the Huangguo energy cubes disappear into Dark Crow's beak. He'd been feeding the creature these precious cubes for 5 days now, and each day their potency seemed to fade a little more. With only 2 doses left, he had no choice but to wait out the diminishing returns. If he switched to a different type of energy block too soon, the 2 energies might interfere with one another and do more harm than good. He could only endure these final 48 hours and hope for the best. Dark Crow let out a series of eager caws, then shook his head and, most importantly, nodded as though suppressing his longing for another cube, but pledging his trust in Ethan's decision. Ethan settled beside him and began working through the massage techniques he'd learned long ago in a past life. After a hard day of training and combat, a thorough nightly rub-down not only soothed the beast's stiff muscles, but also sped its recovery. Dark Crow's ruffled feathers slowly smoothed under Ethan's practiced fingers. A low, contented rumble resonated in the bird's throat as he closed his eyes, his tension melting away. 30 minutes later, Dark Crow stretched luxuriously, standing tall and sleek once more. Satisfied, Ethan rose and moved to the campfire where dinner was simmering. The aroma of a rich, creamy fish chowder filled the air. Plump chunks of fatty fish and milky broth promised to restore their strength for whatever lay ahead. As Ethan ladled a steaming bowlful, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Tomorrow, the final energy cube, and whatever fate awaited them beyond, would come soon enough. Ethan and the elf, both drained by the day's labor, settled against the cavern wall and quickly fell asleep. Outside, the nighttime forest thrummed with life, hoots, rustling leaves, and distant howls, yet inside the bat-filled cave, a profound hush reigned. For generations, colonies of echolocating bats had claimed this chamber as their own, their swift ultrasonic calls sealing it off from the world beyond. Safe in that stillness, the only sound that remained was the steady rhythm of 2 peaceful breaths. Chapter 12. A New Strength. 2 days slipped by in the whirlwind of training and travel alongside Ethan and his companion, the Dark Crow. In that short span, their once empty days became tightly packed with routines: wing drills at dawn, strategy discussions at midday, and equipment checks well into the twilight hour. Yet the most striking change was the Dark Crow's own transformation. After devouring a week's worth of Huangguo energy cubes, the creature had finally crawled out of its weakened slump. It was hard to tell if it had reached its ultimate form, but the Dark Crow was more than satisfied with its progress. Where it had once measured little more than a normal crow, it now stood 60 centimeters tall, 10 centimeters taller than its wild brethren. Sleek, jet-black feathers hugged its frame, each plume shining with a glossy sheen that hinted at newfound vitality. Its body had not only grown in size, but also in power. Every wing beat carried explosive force, honed by their daily training sessions. The dark crow could now unleash its windblast skill with flawless precision, and it had even begun to touch the threshold of more advanced storm magic. Remarkably, the extra weight only seemed to sharpen its speed. The larger, heavier form cut through the air faster than ever before. Together, Ethan and the dark crow stood ready for whatever challenge lay ahead, stronger, faster, and more united than ever. Ethan could feel it, the subtle yet undeniable improvements in both his strength and speed. Though his gains weren't as dramatic as Dark Crow's transformation, he noticed his mind felt sharper, his muscles gradually filling out beneath his skin. Every morning, Dark Crow trained relentlessly, never once faltering, and in turn, Ethan pushed himself harder. Despite still wearing ragged clothing in class, Ethan's eyes now shone with a vitality they had never known before. Even the once chilly supersonic bat cave had been given a makeover. Soft straw and leaves now carpeted the floor, banishing the icy chill, and two sturdy wooden shelves stood against the wall, neatly arranged with medicinal roots, dried herbs, and wild fruits that Ethan had foraged himself. In one corner lay a simple cot, draped with the pelt of some unknown beast, its warmth a small comfort against the cave's damp walls. Ethan crouched beside Dark Crow as the bird preened its glossy feathers. He held out the small, glittering cube in his palm. "The effects of the yellow core energy cube have fully run their course," he said, offering the cube with a smile. "It won't do much good if you eat more of these. Now it's time for the Black Speed Energy Cube you've been saving." At the words Black Speed Energy Cube, Dark Crow froze mid-preen. The memory of that electric rush last time made its throat bob. It swallowed hard, its bright eyes locking onto Ethan's outstretched hand. Silently, the bird hopped closer, wings quivering with anticipation. Ethan gently placed the cube on the stone floor. Dark Crow pecked at it once, then seized it between its beak and swallowed it whole in a single fluid motion. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a subtle hum filled the cave, as if the very air had charged itself. Dark Crow's feathers bristled, its muscles quivered. A second later, the bird gave a powerful flap of its wings and lifted itself clear off the ground, circling above Ethan with newfound vigor. Ethan laughed, clapping once on his knee. "That's it. Let's see just how fast you can fly now." Dark Crow swooped. In a blur of black and silver, it darted through the cave's low archways, trailing streaks of shadow behind it. Each turn and dive looked faster, more precise than before. Outside, the first rays of dawn filtered through the cave entrance, painting Ethan and his companion in gold. Ethan stood, rolling his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring another day of training, another chance to push their limits. But for now, he simply watched as Dark Crow soared, every powerful wing beat a testament to how far they had come together. Ethan watched the Dark Crow soar up impatiently at its feeding bowl and sighed with a rueful smile. He opened a small storage compartment, retrieved one of the black velocity energy blocks he'd spent days perfecting, and set it gently before the bird. "From now on, eat as much as you like," he said. "Stock up on these if you get hungry." Unlike the ordinary gold fruit energy blocks, these black velocity blocks brimmed with dark and aerial energies. Precisely what an ascendant elf bird needs. The more you consumed, the greater your capacity to absorb both flight power and shadowed mana. Over the coming weeks, Ethan hoped the Dark Crow's strength and wingspan would grow by leaps and bounds. Though each block was an intermediate grade, its potency was immense. A typical fish-based Dark Crow meal would barely satisfy it, yet only a few of these energy blocks were enough to fill the creature completely. With a soft caw of delight, the crow pecked at the block, savoring its rich, lingering taste. If it weren't for its newfound satiety, it would surely have devoured them all. While the bird finished its lunch, Ethan quickly ate his own. There wouldn't be time later. This afternoon, he planned to explore the forest east of the rocket base. Since the base lay to the west, that direction was off limits. He stuffed the last of his supplies into his pack, slung it over one shoulder, and set off toward the trees, Dark Crow soaring overhead in eager anticipation. Chapter 10. Over the past 2 days, Ethan and his companion, Dark Crow, had been mapping the forest east of the outpost's boundary. Along the way, they'd encountered numerous elven tribes, but 2 in particular caught their attention: the Strongwing clan, whose territory lay 8 kilometers to the northeast, and the Bobo tribe, 15 kilometers to the southeast. These 2 factions had been bitter rivals for generations, skirmishing regularly, but both were powerful enough that Ethan had wisely avoided getting caught between them. In the Strongwing clan lived a formidable level 22 great-beaked matriarch, while the Bobo tribe boasted 2 level 21 BB birds among their ranks. With their strengths so evenly matched, any clash risked drawing in reinforcements, so Ethan played it safe, no meddling in elven affairs. Today's objective was clear: push southward, scout new territory, and if the opportunity arose, let Dark Crow stretch his wings in a light skirmish. Dark Crow was too large now to perch on Ethan's shoulder. Instead, he hovered a few feet above, talons clicking on the warm breeze, ever watchful. Ethan tried to gauge the true scale of this test zone. It felt vast, endless groves and ancient stone ruins, but after leaving the rocket outpost, he hadn't seen another soul. Yet he reminded himself that not every test subject stayed near the base. He thought back to Guga, the first trainee in the initial trial, who vanished at dawn each day to explore the wilderness alone. With the sun climbing toward midday, Ethan tightened the straps of his pack and scanned the dense tree line. Deep within, unseen trails and hidden clearings awaited. He would press on, Dark Crow at his side, determined to unlock whatever secrets this forest still held. Ethan scanned the forest canopy. If all went according to plan, they'd be back at base by sunset. But something told him today might be different. 3 kilometers to the south, Dark Crow signaled urgently. He'd spotted a small group of testers probing the woods ahead. Silently, Ethan and Dark Crow skirted through the undergrowth toward the clearing. There, 3 men lounged beneath a massive oak, each flanked by his elf companion. In the center sat a heavyset man, his gas bomb elf humming with barely contained power inside its transparent sphere. To his left, a skinny youth leaned against the tree trunk. At his feet lay walking grass, its tendrils curled in slumber. On the right, a man in a plain green t-shirt reclined casually, his sonic bat elf dozing on a low branch overhead. "Big bro, we're just going straight in, right?" the youngest tester asked, voice wavering. Fat man in the middle glared at him, pouting in annoyance. "Why wouldn't we? You don't really doubt I can handle it, do you?" No, of course not," the youth stuttered, shifting uneasily. "It's just, can we really trust this plan?" "Trust me," their leader snapped. "Walking grass is one of the weakest elves you can get. You see them everywhere in this forest, and they're useless in a real fight. We've got nothing to worry about." With that, the 3 testers rose to their feet, gearing up to press deeper into the wood. Ethan pressed himself flat against a moss-covered log, fingers curling around an arrow ready to fly. Dark Crow's feathers ruffled as he settled beside him. Sunset, or danger, was drawing nearer, and Ethan knew their day had just taken an unexpected turn. Ethan slid off the dais and let his gaze sweep across the crowded training hall. A wiry youth in green hurried over to a burly competitor everyone called Fat Brother. "You came in 10th in the first test," the green-clad boy panted, eager to flatter. Fat Brother's lips curled into a smug grin. "Heh, if my gas bomb techniques were as effective in straight-up combat, I'd rank much higher." "Absolutely," the youth agreed, straightening his back. "With your strength, Fat Brother, you've got to be in the top 3. Ethan turned to watch a small trainer nervously climb onto the central platform. At his side stood his elf, Walking Grass, a gentle, unremarkable creature that had offered virtually no resistance during capture. It was the trainer's first time working with an elf, and without prior experience or a powerful patron backing him, his chances of making any real progress in these trials were slim. Fat Brother gave an approving nod to his new ally, clearly satisfied with the show of support. Ethan pressed his lips into a thin line. 10th place might be respectable, but he had no intention of staying there. The real test was just beginning. Ethan was small and not particularly skilled, but he was obedient, so the stout adventurer agreed to let him tag along. He paused to unfold 2 worn parchments. "These are the treasure maps I've collected," he said. "One I redeemed from the rankings, the other I picked up at the base exchange. The area they cover isn't vast, but they clearly mark the nearby elf clans. See here? They've even pinpointed the little Lotta tribe we met before. That means we're on the right track." Because he'd secured 10th place in the first trial, the stout adventurer had burned all his points on a map. Few competitors plan as carefully as Ethan. Few can predict what they and their elves will need in the days ahead. That's exactly why the Rockets flood the exchange with treasure maps, both genuine and counterfeit, priced to tempt every thrill-seeker. Many, like the stout man, redeem a map hoping to strike it lucky. In truth, they're all just gamblers at heart. Chapter 13, Battle 3. Ethan crouched behind a rocky outcrop, listening to the trio's heated discussion just a few yards away. He knew the rocket ship was overflowing with treasure maps, and even more importantly, the real riches bound to them. Regulations forbade unauthorized redemptions, though, so Ethan had planned to stay behind and process his own claims once he returned. Now, chance had delivered this treasure-hunting party right into his path. The first man was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered and heavyset, he carried a yellow-grade gas bomb at his belt. Not the highest-level ordnance, but the man's mastery of its fumes made it a formidable weapon. To his right, a lean hunter cradled a green supersonic bat, its sleek contours hinting at devastating speed. The third member lingered slightly behind, silent and watchful. Ethan's pulse quickened. Any encounter in these wild plains could turn deadly in an instant. Could the bomb specialist trigger a self-detonation? His helmet's scanner was too far away to confirm. And if the bat wielder had fully charged that weapon, a single strike could shatter armor. Ethan weighed his options: retreat, parley, or preemptive strike, while the desert wind whipped up grit around him, a reminder that every second counted. After 2 solid days of battles, Ethan's Dark Raven had finally hit level 13 and learned 2 new moves: Black Mist and Gust. He lay flat on his stomach, one hand pressed into the soft earth, the other barely touching the Pokégear clipped to his belt. The thick underbrush of the forest floor offered perfect cover, and Dark Raven crouched silently on his shoulder, wings folded tight so not even a whisper of sound would give them away. Ahead of them, barely 5 meters through the ferns, stood 3 trainer-owned grass-type Pokémon. Wild Pokémon were one thing, but these were disciplined fighters, with higher stats and unpredictable tactics. Ethan forced himself to stay perfectly still, even as his leg throbbed with pain. Getting any closer would risk detection. Any rustle in the leaves might alert the trainers. Yet at this distance, his Pokégear chip could still get a clean scan. He tapped the device and let the data flow. Pokémon, Dark Raven. Gender, male, level 13. Type, dark flying. Nature, mischievous, first to act with status moves. Held item, none. Egg moves, foul play, sucker punch, feather dance. Basic moves, peck, scary face, pursuit, dark mist, gust, TM moves, snatch, tailwind. Ethan exhaled sharply and pressed the tiny speaker button. A soft beep confirmed the scan of the 3 grass types. Now he just had to figure out what to do with that information, without ever making a sound. Ethan's vision suddenly flared with light, and the stats for the 3 summoned elves appeared before him. As he'd predicted, the first was a grade 14 yellow-tier gas bomb slime, though it still hadn't unlocked its explode skill. The second showed up as a level 13 orange-tier supersonic bat, exactly as expected. What surprised him was the third, a tiny walking grass elf, also yellow tire, but only level 11, hardly worth serious training. Now that Ethan knew their strengths and weaknesses, his plan crystallized. Even a low-level elf could be dangerous in numbers, and one enemy at 3-1 was riskier than facing 2. Moreover, the walking grass had already been twice thwarted by his companion, Dark Crow, making it the obvious first target. "Dark Crow," Ethan whispered, voice muffled so only the crow could hear. "Summon the wind and bait the grass elf in close. Then strike from a distance, follow up with your peck to finish it off. Take it down first." Dark Crow tilted his head and gave a confident nod. After days of fighting side by side, they developed a near-telepathic rapport. A single instruction was all it took. Ethan lifted 3 fingers in a silent countdown, and the battle was on. Ethan watched in tense silence as the last pale finger fell into place. The air around the Dark Crow turned icy white, and its eyes sharpened into obsidian and pearl. Then, Thud. E-final bone clicked against the wooden base. With a mighty tremor of its wings, the crow sent a fierce gale roaring through the underbrush. The wind ripped at the tall grasses and laid low the saplings, bearing the forest floor. Aya let out a soft laugh and shook her head in admiration. Ethan sprang to his feet just in time to see the bird swoop toward the sluggish form of the walking grass. In an instant, twin blades of wind, sharp as razor edges, swept from the crow's wings. Ethan recognized the technique at once, gale slash followed by wing gust. If those strikes connected, the walking grass wouldn't stand a chance. The three hunters flanking them tumbled clear of the attack zone, their reflexes surprisingly quick. Even the burliest among them, a man who looked more accustomed to feasting than fighting, rolled aside with unexpected agility. Their gadgets sprang to life too. Gas bombs hissed and detonated harmlessly midair, while supersonic bat drones scattered at the last moment. But the dark crow's blows were unrelenting. Two concentrated blasts of wind tore into the walking grass, which stood frozen in place, its dull eyes staring vacantly ahead. Thwack! The gusts slammed home, shredding leaves and wood alike. The forest shook with the impact as the creature staggered, its emerald stalks bending, fracturing, and cracking beneath the onslaught. Ethan lunged forward, Dark Crow swooping in at his side. With a thunderous crash, the crow's talons struck the walking grass twice, sending it crashing to the ground, and even denting the earth beneath. Before anyone could react, Dark Crow beat its wings and summoned a gust of wind, then darted in to peck at the sprawling plant's weakened stem. "Gas bombs! Fire!" one of the elves shouted. "Supersonic bat! Bite it! Now!" called the other. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Dark Crow, dodge!" he cried, abandoning any thought of hiding. The two elves unleashed their own attacks to cover the crow's retreat, and with a sharp twist of its body, the bird evaded their blasts by mere inches. The walking grass writhed weakly for a moment, its vines flopping limply before falling utterly still. "Walking grass," the small man whispered, fear and fascination warring in his eyes. He didn't dare step closer. His frame was far too slight to face whatever final lash the creature might muster. The fat man glared down at the small, crying figure crumpled on the ground, his face hardening as he spat, "Useless." At that moment, Ethan recognized his attackers. The fat man and the youth in green glanced at each other. Both knew him all too well, second place in the first trial. "Well, look who it is," the fat man sneered. "Mr. Lucky Second." Chingmutong's lips curved in a sly smile, but he stayed silent. Rumors of Ethan's unconventional technique had already spread through the base, and most dismissed it as a mere parlor trick. Ethan saw no point in defending himself. "Don't think that second-place fluke makes you special," the fat man taunted. "Hide behind your little victory if you must, but do you dare stand up to us?" He signaled to the boy in green. The youth nodded without a word. "Supersonic bat, dive in and strike him with your wings. Gas bomber, release the haze. Dark Crow, create a gust to clear it away." Ethan relaxed. "Very well," he said quietly. Under his steady command, Dark Crow showed no hesitation. As the crow flapped its wings, a powerful wind swept through the swirling mist, parting it just as Supersonic Bat swooped in at full speed. Though the bat took the brunt of the gust, it pressed on, determined to reach Ethan's position. Ethan's Dark Crow quivered as one wing glowed faintly, then lashed out into the swirling fog. A sharp gust scattered the murk, but no sooner had the haze lifted than a gas bomb bore down on them. At the same moment, the supersonic bat swooped in, its razor-thin wings raking across Dark Crow's side. The crow cried out and tumbled backward several meters, but despite the sting of injury, he quickly regained his footing. "Gas bomb, malicious pursuit, now," the rotund trainer barked. Malicious pursuit was lethal in this moment, doubling the bomb's power against an already wounded foe. At 120 points of force, a single strike could finish Dark Crow for good. Ethan didn't flinch. "Dark Crow, rely on your speed. Dodge that gale." His voice was calm, his confidence absolute. Even injured, his crow's agility remained its greatest asset. "Surprise strike. Attack the supersonic bat," Ethan commanded. Dark Crow angled his wings and catching the downdraft to accelerate. He slipped past the charging gas bomb, weaving through its blistering advance, and closed the distance to the bat in a heartbeat. Talons flashing, he lunged upward, determined to turn the tables on the airborne adversary. Ethan barked an urgent command. Ultrasonic bat, fall back, now! But the dark crow was already diving in. A surprise strike only works if it connects, and with a sharp thwack, its razor-like beak raked across the bat's wing. The ultrasonic bat reeled from the hit and retreated instantly. There would be no drawn-out battle today. Chapter 14. Unicorn Territory. Dark Raven weaved effortlessly through the drifting gas bomb, then struck the supersonic bat with a crushing blow. The bat staggered, then collapsed to the ground, defeated. Ethan watched from the edge of the clearing, a crooked smile teasing the corner of his mouth. With the bat neutralized, the gas bomb posed no real threat. Across the field, the broad-shouldered man in dirty leather, the fat man, as everyone called him, seethed in frustration. He lunged forward again and again, but couldn't even graze Dark Raven's feathers. Beside him stood a younger companion, clad in green. The boy's face had gone pale. He looked uncertain, frozen in place. "Idiot," the fat man roared, veins bulging in his thick neck. "Quit standing there gawking. He's just one man. Go in and get him. You want to wait here until he kills us all?" A cold bead of sweat traced down the boy's temple. If their gas bomb had failed, they were that much more vulnerable. Heart-hammering, the youth in green drew in a sharp breath. Then, with shaking fingers, he drew a dagger from his belt and gripped it as though his life depended on it, because it did. Ethan surveyed the ruined courtyard with the cool detachment of a seasoned fighter. Without their gas bombs, the three assailants were reduced to nothing more than unarmed martial artists. The rotund man who'd been slumped against a broken pillar blinked himself back to alertness, rose on unsteady legs, and glared at Ethan with reddish eyes. At his side, two wiry teenagers, faces pale, bodies trembling, took up battle stances and charged. Ethan didn't even flinch. In his previous life as a member of the Rockets, he'd faced far worse than a trio of frightened kids. Even weakened, his years of martial training made these boys mere obstacles. Three desperate amateurs, no threat at all. "Dark Crow, handle the big one first," he ordered in a low, even tone. With a harsh, echoing caw, the obsidian-feathered crow swooped down. The fat man's scream choked off in terror as the bird's gleaming talons ripped across his throat. He clutched at the wound, blood welling between trembling fingers, and collapsed in a silent heap. The remaining boys hesitated only an instant. Deprived of their volatile weapons, they were easy prey. In a blur of precise strikes and ruthless efficiency, Ethan and Dark Crow cut down the last two. Within moments, all three lay motionless on the cracked stone floor, proof that without their bombs, they were nothing more than sitting ducks. Ethan didn't spare a second glance for the three survivors' desperate stares. He'd long since learned that this world offered no kindness, only predators and prey. In a place where every stranger might be an enemy, compassion could be deadly. Mercy to them would mean cruelty to himself. Only those who remained standing when the dust settled truly survived. With that thought, he deftly unhooked each storage belt from their belts and slung them over his shoulder. Without looking back, he turned and strode into the deep woods alongside Dark Crow. The stench of death lingered in the air, and Ethan knew it wouldn't be long before the foul odor drew the forest's evil elves to feast. By dawn, these bodies would be nothing more than bones. After an uncertain length of time, Ethan and Dark Crow found a hollow by an ancient oak and sank down. Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out 3 black speed energy blocks. He handed one to his raven companion, who pecked gratefully at it, its feathers rustling softly. Then Ethan laid out the spoils from the defeated trio's belts. He sifted through handfuls of miscellaneous trinkets and scraps. Old coins, broken tools, dried herbs, but most of it was useless. He pocketed a small dagger whose blade still gleamed, a modest ration of preserved food, and a few basic daily supplies. To his surprise, tucked in among the young man in green's possessions was a bottle of healing spray, priceless in this wilderness. Ethan frowned, wondering where it had come from. Had the green-clad youth stolen it from someone else? He couldn't be sure. Securing his new equipment, Ethan rose and cast a wary eye into the shadows beyond the oak. There was no time to waste. Survival belonged to those who moved quickly, and to those ruthless enough to seize every advantage. With Dark Crow at his side, Ethan set off once more into the forest, prepared for whatever lay ahead. Aya peered at the lopsided treasure map in her hand, and Ethan could only stare in disbelief. These maps were supposed to be a newcomer's reward from the rockets, but whoever drew this must have hated straight lines. Every landmark and even the lettering leaned at odd angles. For a measly 100 points, it was hardly a masterpiece. Still, they'd already heard the briefing from the rotund guide. The treasure lay due south of the cave, beyond 2 elf tribes. First came the Little Lotta clan, then the Unicorn people, and finally the Green Caterpillar tribe, who were rumored to be the true guardians of the hoard. The plump guide had warned them that unicorn territory was far more perilous than any green caterpillar burrow. Those critters might hide their gold underground, but they grew so fast and in such numbers that they attracted giant needlebees, towering insects that reigned supreme over any forest they inhabited. Steeling themselves, Aya tucked the crooked map into her pack. "Ready?" she asked Ethan. He took a deep breath and nodded. There was no turning back now. Ethan heard the elf's voice echo through the trees. "You're not one of us, are you? Then you'd best turn back. Our giant needlebees don't take kindly to strangers." He shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't the elves' personal strength that unnerved him, but their hive mind. Anger one giant needlebee, and you'd soon find yourself hunted by the whole relentless swarm. Such exclusivity and aggression made both him and Darkcrow's feathers stand on end. Still, the only guidance he had was the faint line traced on his treasure map. Who knew what lay along any detour, a widening river, or even more powerful elves? Unknown dangers were far less tempting than a known threat. With a decisive nod, Ethan slipped the map into his pouch. He straightened, dusting grit from his coat, then gestured to Darkcrow. The raven scraped a shallow pit in the forest floor. Together they gathered 3 lengths of useless belt and every bit of discarded debris and buried them under a thin layer of earth. A few firm stamps flattened the ground, erasing any sign of their work. Satisfied, Ethan gave Darkcrow a final look and headed back onto the winding path, determined to see just where the map would lead them next. Ethan moved silently through the dense forest, dagger in hand. He hacked away thorny branches that barred the narrow path, crouching under low-hanging limbs as the dark crow perched on his arm, its glossy feathers ruffling in the dim light. Neither dared make a sound. Every rustle could draw unwanted attention. They'd already come 7, maybe 8 kilometers since Ethan's skirmish with the trio, and now they had slipped into the unicorn's territory marked on his tattered map. Keeping to the shadows, they hoped to avoid the giant needlebees said to patrol these woods. After another cautious kilometer, Ethan let out a silent breath of relief. So far, he'd seen no unicorns, no iron-plated crickets, and no hives of stinging bees. Still, he couldn't shake the tension that knotted his shoulders. Then a glint of gold ahead stopped him cold. In a small clearing stood a massive oak, its lower branches draped in clusters of gleaming cocoons. On almost every limb, 3 or 4 amber-tinted pods swung gently, like lanterns against the emerald canopy. Ethan's heart hammered. Whatever creatures lay within those husks, they were waiting for him. Ethan halted at Hagi's sharp intake of breath, peering into the dense undergrowth. They still hadn't spotted a single giant needlebee, but that was little comfort. An iron carapace in its pupal stage could, at the slightest fright, burst forth as a fully grown giant needlebee, and in their current situation, that would mean facing its deadliest form from the moment it emerged. Beneath Ethan, the dark raven shifted uneasily, its feathers bristling. The beast was more than a match for most foes, but even it would hesitate before a newly evolved giant needlebee. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins, urging the raven forward with painstaking caution. They moved in near silence for another 2 hours, skirting through the fringes of the unicorn's territory. At last, the forest thinned, and in the fading light they saw the telltale signs of a new domain, the looming hives and buzzing patrols that marked giant needlebee ground. According to every traveler's tale, this swarm was on the rise. If left undisturbed, it would soon stand among the forest's most formidable forces. Ethan exchanged a tense glance with Hagi. Beyond this point lay true peril, and no room for error. Chapter 15, Kairos. Ethan brushed a bead of sweat from his brow. Though he'd roamed the farthest reaches of the forest, nothing had unsettled him quite like the iron shell cricket would. At any moment, those armored crickets could undergo a gruesome metamorphosis, mutating into giant stinger bees whose venom was so potent that, without an antidote, death was all but certain. Even if he managed to slip away, the twisting, overgrown paths left little room to evade their lethal strikes. When he finally emerged, the air felt refreshingly cool. Above him, the dark-winged ravens that had long skulked in hiding burst into flight. Even these swift, airborne elves would be hard-pressed to confront a swarm of 100 stinger bees. Beyond that lay the territory of the green caterpillars, once a sanctuary of unicorn glades, now rumored to be overrun by the same iron-armored invaders. Still, this region was infinitely preferable to the cricket forest. The iron-armored larvae proved surprisingly placid. As long as a traveler didn't harass them, they simply lay curled in the underbrush, posing no threat at all. Ethan paused at the forest's edge, inhaling the fresh, untainted air. For the first time in hours, he dared to hope he might pass through these woods unscathed, and that whatever lay deeper in Kairos would test him less mercilessly than the iron-shell crickets. Ethan paused beneath the canopy, noting how even colossal butterflies flitted harmlessly through these woods. The map in his hands affirmed he was still on course. Steeling himself, he set off once more along the narrow, winding trail. Above him, a glossy black crow hovered effortlessly, as though recently freed from a cage. It would not alight any time soon. According to his map's terrain markings, he needed to travel another few kilometers before the hillside appeared, and there, somewhere among the roots, lay his quarry. The sun was sliding toward the western horizon, casting long, cool shadows that danced around trunks and ferns. In the soft green hush of the forest, Ethan passed an iron-armored cricket, its shell gleaming faintly, waiting patiently for metamorphosis into a butterfly. He offered it a nod of respect, then continued uphill. At last, he reached the slope the map had promised. A single ancient tree stood at its crest, its girth so vast that 3 people linking hands could barely span it. According to legend, the treasure was buried in a hollow at its base. Ethan's breath caught when he spotted movement above. Perched on a sturdy branch was an elf, distinctive not only for his pointed ears, but for 2 sweeping horns crowning his head. The elf's body shifted as though scanning the forest floor. His pale eyes flicked from shadow to shadow. With a graceful motion, he lifted one slender arm skyward, palm open, and let out a soft, melodic call. Almost at once, the dark crow wheeled down from its vigil, wings beating a whisper in the dappled light. Ethan crouched behind a moss-covered rock, heart pounding. He had found the tree, and something, or someone, was already waiting for him. Ethan barely moved before the dark crow cut its hover short and swooped in his direction. He guided the shadowy bird toward the base of the hill. Once he was within 5 meters, Ethan tapped his wrist chip and brought up a full readout on the strange elf before him. Creature data, name Kairos, orangey, species bug spirit, gender, female level, 18 ability, unusual pincers, held item resin genetic skill feint attack, basic moves, pinch, gas gather, constrict, earthbind, harden, counterstrike, forced descent, TM move, bug bite, learnable moves, none. Ethan frowned as he studied the stats. Kairos was no ordinary spirit. He'd known her well in his previous life. She'd borne a rare green aptitude and a unique metamorphic trait, marking her as the team's main attacker. With a base attack of 125 and defense of 100, she packed a serious punch, and her speed stat of 85 kept her 1 step ahead of most opponents. Only her low HP growth held her back from a full evolution. Otherwise, she'd likely have become a fire spirit powerhouse. Even now, a level 18 bug spirit like Kairos was enough to make any rookie trainer quake. Ethan crouched at the base of the rocky incline, eyeing the coiled serpent before him. Kairos wasn't just any guardian beast. Its 18 levels of power and razor-sharp horns made it a serious threat, despite its orange tier designation. Any creature that dared come too close was met with a savage attack, and once those massive horns found purchase, escape was impossible. This was easily the strongest opponent Ethan and his companion, the Dark Crow, had ever faced. Yet the glittering treasure at the summit was too valuable to pass up, and Kairos's notoriously bad temper left no room for negotiation. "Dark Crow, be careful of those horns. Don't let it pin you," Ethan warned, his voice low but urgent. Fortunately, the crow's demonic flight system granted it a devastating advantage. All aerial strikes dealt double damage to grounded foes like Kairos. The crow's coal-black eyes flashed as it let out a sharp "Gah!", a word of agreement and determination. "Now!" Ethan called. In a blur of ebony wings, the dark crow dove, talons slicing through the air. Its first strike tore into Kairos's exposed flank, and the serpent recoiled with a pained hiss, its meal scattering to the wind. Bones cracked under the blow, and Kairos whipped its head around in fury, venomous fangs bared. But the crow was already pulling up, looping overhead for another hit. As Ethan readied himself for the next phase of the battle, he knew they'd only just begun. But for now, they had the upper hand. A surge of anger welled up inside me. Kairos, our local overlord, had always tormented everyone around him, crunching on power like a tyrant. Now someone dared to attack him during his meal? It was the ultimate insult. "Stop!" Kairos thundered at the dark crow flitting around his banquet. He leaped to his feet and drew a deep breath, centering himself. Instantly, a wind current coalesced around him from head to toe, the first stage of his skill, focusing his chi to guarantee a critical strike. With Kairos's high attack power, combined with channeled energy, any blow he landed now would be devastating. But I'd anticipated his move. "Dark Raven, use robbery," I barked. At my command, a sickly black mist poured out from Kairos's body. His gathered wind current dissolved mid-manifestation, scattering into nothing. As the inky vapor engulfed the crow, its eyes brightened with predatory sharpness. Under the corrupting influence of the robbery skill, and fueled by the raven's own cunning heart, it leached away Kairos's concentrated chi before he could even strike. In that moment, Kairos's advantage vanished, and a chance opened for us to turn the tide. Dark Raven, feeding off the crowd's energy, fixed his sharp eyes on Ethan. His body trembled with barely contained power, wings twitching, talons poised, every feather quivering as if screaming to strike Ethan's weak points. Dark Raven knew that one well-placed blow would cripple his opponent. "Dark Raven, amplify your airflow," Ethan ordered. A mischievous glint lit the Raven's eye. He felt no risk in turning the crowd's boost into his own weapon. With a powerful shudder of his wings, Dark Raven unleashed two razor-sharp gusts of wind straight at Ethan's most vulnerable spots. "Thwack! Thwack!" Ethan cried out as the twin blasts slammed into him. He hadn't even registered why his usual defenses were failing when scorching pain tore through his side, far more intense than any attack before. He snarled, eyes bloodshot, helpless on the ground, while his foe swooped down on him. Cornered and unable to strike back, Ethan gathered his resolve. Summoning every ounce of strength, he activated his hardest skill, body hardening. In an instant, his flesh and bones stiffened into a living shield, braced and ready for the next onslaught. Chapter 16, Skill CD. Ethan stifled a laugh as he watched Kairos stubbornly flail at his foe. This was why wild elves differed so dramatically from trainer-tamed creatures. They fought by their own instincts and wits, never waiting for orders. "Keep using snatch," he called out. Kairos lunged again and again, each snatch more forceful than the last, unaware that his opponent had been baiting him. Without warning, a familiar black mist, the dark crow's shadow veil, swept over Kairos's body, its corruptive aura reasserting itself. Ethan's brow furrowed. He'd dispelled that curse only moments before and assumed it couldn't take hold again so swiftly. With a gasp of frustration, Ethan wove his hands in the air and invoked his hardening wards a second time. Golden filaments of energy shot from Kairos toward the dark crow, tearing through the oppressive haze and redirecting it squarely back at the enemy. The crow shrieked, wings beating furiously as the inky vapor clung to its feathers. Ethan's dual hardening blessings snapped into place, transforming each plume into rigid, armor-like plates. A chorus of metallic squeaks rang out as the crow staggered under its own newfound defenses. It uttered a strangled caw, caw of confusion and pain, while Kairos answered with a triumphant roar, his first clear sign that the battle's momentum had finally shifted. Ethan unleashed his windgust skill one more time. Kairos, thoroughly embarrassed, threw up his hands and bolted. With a base speed of 85, he might have escaped most pursuers, but not Ethan's Dark Raven. The bird boasted a speed of 91, bolstered further by the tailwind blessing, and it tore after Kairos in relentless swoops. Each strike carried the raven's gas concentration effect, chipping away at Kairos' stamina. He faltered halfway through his flight, lungs burning, and finally dropped to the ground in defeat. Ethan raised a hand to halt the raven's talons. It was not his intent to kill. He simply needed a worthy opponent to train his familiar. As Kairos lay panting, the raven let out a triumphant caw. The moment was electric. The bird's ferocity, unrestrained by any cooldown or holdback, was something Ethan had never seen. And when the last echo of that cry faded, the dark raven's level climbed, 13 at last, proof that this victory had given it a surge of experience. Ethan allowed himself a satisfied smile. Kairos had been a strong opponent, and the training had paid off perfectly. The raven flapped its wings, feathers ruffling in the tailwind, as if sharing Ethan's pride. Today, they had both emerged stronger. Ethan, an elf chosen by the Dark Crow as the perfect vessel for its next evolution, couldn't decide whether to feel fortunate or betrayed by fate. Would he emerge from this trial alive, or would the promise of power prove a tragic sentence? He strolled beneath the towering oak, its colossal branches woven into a living canopy that blotted out the sky and dimmed the afternoon sun. The air grew noticeably cooler under that green ceiling. Pausing, Ethan knelt on the soft earth and picked up a broken branch, a crude substitute for a shovel. With steady pressure, he drove the wood into the ground, turning over the loose soil. Above him, the dark crow circled once, then settled on a broad limb. It bobbed its head as if admiring its handiwork. In its being, it carried the instinctive bond of all bird elves to the trees they revered. Suddenly, the branch struck something hard. Ethan set it aside, brushed back the dirt with his hand, and revealed a small metal box, its surface gleaming faintly in the muted light. Whatever lay inside, it had waited here long enough to become a secret of the earth, and perhaps the key to what the Dark Crow had planned for him. Ethan knelt beside the patch of earth that hadn't been disturbed in who knows how long. The soil was surprisingly shallow, barely 4 inches deep. No wonder it yielded so easily to his shovel. He eased out a small metal box, dusting off loose clods. It felt lighter than he'd expected. With a few more gentle taps, he revealed its silvery white surface. A jet-black crow swooped down from a nearby branch and landed on a stone beside him, watching intently. Ethan settled cross-legged on the grass and placed the case in his lap. A tiny lock sealed the lid. "All right, Raven, give that lock a soft peck," he said. With a sharp click, the crow's beak snapped the lock free in one precise motion. Ethan lifted the lid and peered inside. Resting in a velvet-lined recess was a single disc, no larger than his palm, glowing with a steady white light. There was nothing else in the box. Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel a faint hum under his fingertips, as if the disc itself were alive and waiting for him. Ethan stared at the treasure map sprawled before him. It was only worth 100 points, practically pocket change in the rocket's broad scheme, but what struck him was how haphazard the whole thing felt. The map was crudely drawn, the burial site marked with no disguise, and the depth of the pit left to random chance. Dig down and you'd find a large box, empty, save for a single compact disc. He shook his head, banishing the chaotic chain of thoughts. Even so, Ethan couldn't help feeling pleased. 100-point treasure map was nothing to scoff at. The CD itself was a skill disc. What ability it held remained a mystery until he ran it through a skill machine, but the disc's white glow suggested a general attribute skill, surely worth more than a mere 100 points. He snapped the box closed and tucked it into his storage unit. He wouldn't bother with it until he returned to base. There, he'd have Dark Crow run the disc through its systems. And if it proved incompatible, well, he could always sell it back to the Rockets for a tidy sum of points. Either way, this little windfall had the potential to pay off. Ethan glanced over Team Rocket's point system again. Points weren't just earned during ranking trials. Instead, members could also trade points for items or take on missions to rack up even more. This structure existed everywhere Rocket operated, on the mainland and here on Trial Island, but accumulating points on the island proved surprisingly difficult. Most missions Ethan saw involved little more than scrubbing floors or foraging for tree fruits and wild herbs. He'd already turned in enough fruit to earn 80 points, though he had no idea how many berries that represented, and cleaning assignments paid only a handful of credits each. The meager rewards told him something. This was the first wave of new recruits, and the organization had held back the real work for those who stayed. Team Rocket didn't mind if trainers fell in the field. Still, they preferred not to waste live assets, especially when even novice Pokémon, however weak, were more valuable than an unproven recruit. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the tougher, deadlier missions opened up, and he'd better be ready. Ethan glanced at the Rocket's exchange counter with a mix of wariness and excitement. Their policy was notorious. You only ever get back 70% of an item's listed value. Turn in something worth 100 points, and you walk away with just 70, ensuring the Rockets always come out on top. Yet nobody seemed to mind. People still queued, trading away their rarest finds for the chance to browse the Rocket's one-of-a-kind inventory. When Ethan and Dark Raven presented their treasure map, originally valued at 100 points, the merchant barely looked up. With a bored shrug, he discounted it 30 points on the spot. Even the burly fighter who'd been shadowing them all morning hadn't managed a deal this sweet. Ethan's jaw dropped. The merchant's indifference was maddening, but the bargain felt too good to pass up. Moments later, Ethan sat cross-legged beside their campfire, the ornate box he'd purchased balanced on his knee. He lifted the lid and gently retrieved a gleaming CD. Legends said these discs sometimes contained lost divine techniques, skills so rare they could be worth tens of thousands of points once decoded. Heart-hammering, Ethan slipped the CD into his personal storage drive and held his breath, savoring the victory. Next to him, Yu leaned back against a tree trunk, a weathered tome open across his lap. Propping his chin on his hands, he stared off into space, lost in thought as the crackle of the fire filled the night. Ethan watched the last of the restorative light fade from the sky and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. His 1-week recovery regimen for Dark Crow had been a success. According to his careful measurements, Dark Crow's strength was now back to, if not beyond, its previous peak. But there was no time for celebration. Ethan knew they'd be stranded on this island for at least 2 more months, and every day counted. He needed a clear, long-term plan. First priority, with supplies dwindling and no safe way to capture another elf, Dark Crow would have to remain his sole companion throughout their trials. All resources and training would go toward him. Second, Dark Crow's level was still far below that of most other trainers' elves. Ethan blamed himself for having hesitated too long in earlier battles, but he'd learned from those mistakes. While exploring the island for hidden treasures, he'd quietly tested a new approach, and it paid off. When he managed to outwit and defeat Kairos, a fearsome level 18 opponent, Ethan realized his strategy worked. He reminded himself of Dark Crow's greatest strengths. As a darkness and flying type elf, it naturally counters both superpower type and ghost type adversaries. That elemental advantage, combined with a focused training regimen, could carry them through the toughest challenges ahead. Tonight, Ethan made a promise. Tomorrow, Dark Crow's next evolution would begin. Flying-type elves are surprisingly scarce on this island. Instead, the terrain is overrun by grass, insect, and combat clans. Aside from the 2 regions Ethan and his companions passed through earlier, the Unicorn Domain and the Green Caterpillar Realm, this place is nothing if not a natural training ground for airborne warriors. True, the unicorns have now sealed themselves inside iron-clad pupae, and the green caterpillars have forged themselves into iron-armored chrysalis, but that poses little threat. Even if swarms of giant needlebees or great-winged butterflies were to materialize, or a crafty dark crow harried them with hit-and-run tactics, the danger would be minimal. Chapter 17, The Great Needle Hive. Ethan paused on the ridge and scanned the western sky. Dusk was approaching fast, and there wasn't enough daylight to launch a full-scale assault on the massive needle bee swarm below. Worse, fighting at night would cripple their hit-and-run tactics. While needle bees lose much of their eyesight in the dark, under the same moonless shroud, neither his green crow nor Rao's dark crow could navigate reliably. And beyond that, the forest at night harbored too many unknown threats. What if a powerful elf sprang from the shadows? There was only one sensible course. Before sundown, Ethan would circle the hillside, pinpoint any elf encampments, and chart a safe escape route. He guided Dark Crow, his black feathered glider, up toward the great oak halfway up the slope. According to local lore, Kairos himself once roosted in this tree. Now that Dark Crow had bested Kairos here, the hollowed trunk belonged to its rightful victor. No elf would dare disturb a crow bearing the mark of the fallen warlord. Rao followed a moment later on Green Crow, settling beside Ethan in the oak's sturdy branches. Together, they unloaded their light gear and secured the mounts deep within the tree's hollow. Lanterns were lit, casting dancing shadows against ancient bark as the two men shared a simple meal in tense silence. The forest around them began its nighttime chorus, an ominous reminder that beyond this oak, danger still lurked. But for one night at least, the old oak would stand sentinel over them. With the Needlebee hive shadowed below and their escape route planned in the fading light, Ethan and Rao settled in, readying themselves for the dawn's battle. Chapter 7. Silent Hillside. Kairos had vanished without a trace. When Ethan and the Dark Raven returned to the clearing where they'd defeated the towering elf warrior, the ground lay undisturbed. No body, no blood, nothing. Had Kairos fled on his own or been dragged off by some unseen predator? Night was falling fast, and the only answer came in the soft rustle of grass. Ethan surveyed their surroundings. At their feet, the hillside swarmed with green caterpillars and clusters of iron-armored crickets, their carapaces glinting in the fading light. To the north stretched a barren plain of iron crustaceans, hulking crabs whose shells carried the crunch of steel. Eastward, the walking grasses rippled like a living sea, dotted here and there by grotesque stinky flowers whose foul miasma could stun a man. A scattering of those carnivorous blooms clung to the southern slopes. In the west, there were no organized elf bands, only lone hunters, retailers, too weak to rival even the smallest war beasts. Putting the landscape's details aside, Ethan set to work. He gathered dead branches and brittle leaves beneath a sturdy oak, struck his flint, and coaxed a small fire to life. From his pack, he drew the Dark Raven's energy cube, a translucent block pulsing with pale violet light, and placed it in a shallow basin. The Raven hopped forward, feathers ruffled in eager anticipation. After nearly 24 hours of relentless fighting, its appetite was prodigious. Ethan watched the creature tear into the cube by lamplight. He knew that each energy block the Raven consumed only made it stronger. As embers glowed and the Raven fed, Ethan allowed himself a moment's peace. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, one victory at a time. Ethan watched his elven companion, the Dark Crow, caw happily as he pulled a few strips of jerky from his pack and held them over the campfire. Nearby, a kettle of fresh water bubbled to a boil. In minutes, they had a simple but hearty dinner of grilled meat and hot broth, enough to restore their strength for the journey ahead. As darkness settled, the forest came alive with the chirps of crickets and the rustle of night insects. Ethan and the Dark Crow climbed a tall oak, one man and one elf seeking refuge on its sturdiest branch. Beneath a canopy of stars, they drifted into a peaceful sleep. When dawn's first light tinted the sky, Ethan was already stirring. The Raven ruffled its glossy feathers beside him. Ever since his rise to near-royal power, the restless vices of his past had quietly slipped away. After a brisk breakfast of jerky and forest berries, they packed up camp. Bathed in the warm glow of sunrise, they set off together toward today's objective, the Iron Shell territory. Ethan moved through the territory of green caterpillars and iron-armored worms just as smoothly as before, heading straight for the forest, blanketed in iron shells. I watched him approach, speechless. The trees and undergrowth were coated in overlapping metal plates, and the sight alone would send anyone with the slightest insect phobia running in terror. In the world of worm elves, evolving from a unicorn to an iron shell maggot and finally into a giant needlebee is the standard growth path. Given ample resources, a unicorn can complete its final metamorphosis in roughly 15 days without a single flaw. Once it reaches the giant needlebee stage, its speed and attack power becomes so formidable that most elves wouldn't dare challenge it. Yet, during the unicorn and iron shell phases, these creatures remain surprisingly fragile. A unicorn without specialized adventuring skills is limited to weaving silk and firing poison needles. Its defenses are thin, and its stamina is nearly non-existent. Ethan studied the data on the iron-shelled maggots. Their defenses had spiked since evolving, but apart from a single harden ability, their skill set was unchanged, and their predictable lumbering movement made them easy prey for natural predators. According to the Rocket Corps' charts, this region had only ever been home to unicorns, so it was officially designated unicorn territory, and that meant the buried treasure here had to have been placed before any trainees landed on the island. In other words, there shouldn't have been time for these iron carapaced crustaceans to evolve yet. With a casual flick of his wrist, Ethan swept the area with his scanner. The results were exactly what he expected. Iron shell crickets at grade 7 and 8. Not particularly powerful on their own, but if he let a horde of them swarm together, the experience points would be enormous. That wasn't an option. If these larvae grew unchecked and eventually matured into a massive needle bee colony, they'd consume every scrap of energy in the forest, and that would derail the entire operation. Ethan's lips curved into a steely smile. He'd be damned if he let that happen. "Dark Raven," he called, voice echoing across the clearing. "Unleash Wind Blast on the iron shells." His raven-shaped familiar flared its wings, a vortex of gale-force winds twisting toward the unsuspecting crickets. In seconds, the battlefield would be clear, and Ethan would be one step closer to securing the treasure and containing any threat in these unicorn lands. "Expand your strike radius and crush as many as you can," Ethan ordered, standing ready beside the Dark Raven. "Caw! Caw!" The jet-black bird bobbed its head and thumped its chest with a confident flap of its wing, as though to reassure Ethan that these crippled, immobile insects posed no threat. Ethan couldn't help but remember his first stumble through this forest, unaware of who or what truly held the power here. Back then, he'd been nothing more than a lost traveler among the countless armored pupae, vulnerable to an unexpected onslaught if their cocoons hatched prematurely. Now, everything had changed. Ethan and the Dark Raven had seized the initiative. With their superior speed, they could strike from one position to the next and vanish before reinforcements even noticed. These scattered pupae in the glade were merely a fringe of the vast brood that claimed this land. Dark Raven spread its wings, and on each feather's tip, 2 miniature whirlwinds took shape. With a rush of air, those twisters roared outward, swelling into powerful vortexes that tore through the clearing. Under the horrified, anxious stares of the armored crickets, dozens of them were swept aloft, then crushed in the raven's merciless gale. The forest erupted in a chorus of panicked cries as iron-shelled cormorants took alarm. Their razor-keening calls echoed from every branch, growing more frantic as volley after volley of their kin plummeted earthward. High above, one lone cormorant clung to a gnarled oak limb, desperately flapping its armored wings, but its shrill protest went unanswered. Dark Crow wasted no mercy. With a powerful beat of its obsidian wings, it summoned twin cyclones that tore through the air like scythe blades. Each gust struck the nearest cormorant, shattering its metal carapace and sending it spiraling to the forest floor. Then, as if on instinct, Dark Crow banked and fanned its wings again. Another pair of wind whirls swept through the branches, and more iron-shelled bodies rained down. No amount of plated armor could withstand those onslaughts. Dark Crow's mastery of aerial combat and its superior skill level left every cormorant defenseless. Within moments, the ground was littered with fallen foes, their vitality sapped and their cries silenced. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Ethan watched with a satisfied gleam in his eye. This display of power, he knew, was only a foretaste of what lay ahead. In this territory, the iron-shelled cormorants had been merely the opening act. The true trial and the greatest danger still awaited him. Buzz, buzz. Ethan froze as that unmistakable hum filled the clearing, resonating from every direction. His heart skipped a beat. Had he misjudged the situation? Was there already a fully formed hive hidden somewhere in this territory? If so, his carefully laid plan could unravel in an instant. He didn't have long to wait. Moments later, 5 giant needle wasps, each with glowing red eyes, swarmed into view, hovering just beyond the tree line. Ethan's tension eased into cautious relief. 5 wasn't an overwhelming number, any more than that, and he'd be forced to withdraw. He'd encountered these fey creatures, known colloquially as giant needle wasps, before, either in the vivid memories of his past life or through the countless anime and games he'd devoured on Earth. Individually, they were unremarkable. average in strength, though they compensated with sheer numbers. Ethan nodded to himself, recalling that basic fact, until the day he faced old Osakagi's personal swarm of Rocket Knight's needle wasps. Back then, their speed and ferocity had shattered every expectation he'd ever harbored. Now, watching these five hover and drum their wings in unison, he reminded himself not to underestimate them. This encounter might be routine if he kept his wits about him. Drawing a steadying breath, Ethan readied himself. The real test was just about to begin. Ethan knew that Team Rocket often chose Pokémon like Beedrill because, with enough resources and training, the payoff could be tremendous. You won't see them trying to raise a hulking powerhouse on par with Snorlax. Those are too costly and slow to train. But a well-prepared Beedrill can easily hit the level of a pseudo-legendary or even challenge elite champions. Giovanni's very first Pokémon was a Beedrill, and as the heir of the former Team Rocket boss, he had access to resources most trainers could only dream of. Every hour of training, every dose of specialized supplements paid dividends that far outstripped the investment. In fact, in the manga, Giovanni's Beedrill managed to defeat Lance's Dragonite in a high-profile battle. On one side stood Dragonite, an iconic pseudo-god among Pokémon, yet the underdog Beedrill claimed the win. That match proved that, with the right backing, a Beedrill's potential isn't something to be underestimated. Ethan had heard the rumors, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a Sting Bee's mega evolution. In an instant, the familiar wasp-like creature ballooned into the fearsome Super Sting Bee, its body hardened into glossy armor, its three massive stingers gleaming dangerously under the arena lights. The moment it struck, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Adaptive, muscles rippled beneath its exoskeleton, unleashing raw, devastating power and a speed so blistering that rival trainers christened it the Reaper of Lives. What truly stunned everyone was how quickly this powerhouse matured. From the day an egg hatched to its first full-scale deployment, barely 14 days passed. Under even modest training, the Super Sting Bee's strength rivaled that of veteran combatants. In record time, it earned a reputation as a top-tier battlefield prospect, so much so that when Mega Evolution was announced, wild demand for Sting Bees swept across the globe. When the very first Super Sting Bee appeared on Earth, it measured no more than a human hand, yet its arrival felt like something ripped from a Pokémon episode come to life. News outlets ran non-stop footage of civilians marveling as the tiny creature outpaced and outmatched seasoned veterans alike. For everyday trainers everywhere, the Super Sting Bee was nothing short of a godsend, a testament to how far the bond between human and elf could evolve. And for Ethan, standing ringside among cheering fans, it was the beginning of a challenge he couldn't wait to meet. Chapter 18: The Giant Stinger Bee Colony. Ethan walked the edge of the tall grass, eyes scanning for any movement among the stalks. In this world, almost every trainer starts out as an ordinary civilian, far from the privileged few shown on hollow anime. Only children born into alliance families, or those whose parents have paid enormous sums since their birth, are granted the 3 elite royal elves by the kingdom's master trainers at age 10. For everyone else, those legendary partners are nothing more than an extravagant dream. If you're lucky enough to have a relative who's already a trainer, you might be able to borrow one. But without that connection, you have to catch your own. That's why so many aspiring trainers turn to the giant stinger bee. They're common, relatively easy to trap, and as long as you respect their venomous stingers, safe enough to handle. Better still, they mature in mere weeks, not months. You don't need expensive equipment or endless training time to forge a decent early battle team. Once you've got a reliable partner, you open up all sorts of possibilities for encountering stronger creatures later on. Ethan crouched low and slowed his breathing. Ahead, a cluster of giant stinger bees buzzed around a flowering bush, feeding on its nectar. He gripped his net launcher and toggled the settings. "All right," he murmured to the device. "Let's give this a try." With a soft hum, the net launcher ejected a glowing mesh that wove through the air and wrapped around the unsuspecting bees. Seconds later, the net contracted and sealed their small bodies inside a containment pod. Heart-pounding, Ethan gently pried the pod open and lifted out 2 dizzy striped bees. A grin spread across his face. "Nice work." He slipped on a thick glove and examined the first bee. Sturdy wings, lively eyes, and a perfectly owned stinger resting harmlessly against its abdomen. He tucked it into a secure cell, then repeated the process with its companion, his backup in case something went wrong. Standing, Ethan surveyed the grassland once more. With a giant stinger bee at his side, he finally had the foundation for a real fighting force. Training would still take effort, but he'd shaved off months of waiting and spared himself the cost of elite gifts. He inhaled the fresh breeze, excitement coursing through him. This was only the beginning. With his new partner ready to grow, Ethan's journey to become a top trainer had truly begun. Even among families of veteran trainers, the starter elf of choice is almost always the giant needle bee. It grows quickly, its potential isn't bad, and it performs well in combat. Of course, top-tier trainers find this hard to understand. After all, not everyone is Sakaki. Only a rare few ever discover an elf of truly exceptional quality and then devote virtually limitless resources to nurturing it into a god-level partner. Given that kind of investment, most would rather raise a quasi-divine elf. By the time it fully matures, it's already top class in power. In his previous life, Ethan had dreamed of training a giant needle bee too, but he eventually abandoned the idea. Yes, it's easy and fast to push one to ordinary battle strength, but trying to go beyond that requires exponentially more effort with diminishing returns. Worse still, these bees live for such a short time that just when your training finally starts to pay off, their strength begins to fade under the weight of their own lifespan. Few possess the legendary resilience of someone like Sakaki, who alone seems able to defy the ruthless advance of time. Ethan's eyes narrowed as 5 enormous beedrill, stingers dripping with venom, swept toward him and his Murkrow, Dark Crow. He tapped the scanner on his wrist. In an instant, identical holographic readouts flickered into the air. Beedrill red, gender male, level 14, type bug poison, ability, insect instinct, held item, none. Moves, twin needle, fury attack, rage. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 5 beedrill, all at the same level, all with the same moves. No surprises. Only 5, and none of them's too strong, he murmured, relief rolling off him in waves. He pivoted to Dark Crow. The Murkrow's glossy feathers fluffed as it readied itself. Dark Crow, use fright! With a harsh caw that echoed through the clearing, Dark Crow spread its wings wide. The air seemed to chill as the 5 beedrill skidded to a halt, uncertainty flickering in their compound eyes. Ethan seized the moment to plan his next move. Knowing that once he'd quelled their anger, he'd have them right where he wanted them. Ethan watched as his elf companion shrank back, visibly shaken by the swarm of giant sting bees. He knew that any panic would only make their fight harder, so he needed to thin their numbers, and fast. Even without a single bee landing a blow, a coordinated attack in a tight pack could wreak havoc. Caw! The Dark Crow let out a harsh, piercing cry and swept toward the 5 unsuspecting sting bees. The shrill sound slammed into their buzzing hive minds like cold water, and 2 of the larger bees froze in midair. Their bodies went rigid, twin stingers trembling, a clear sign of terror. The other 3 hesitated only for an instant before charging back toward the Dark Crow. As they plunged in, luminous lilac sparks flickered around the crow's twin stingers, his double sting ability activating. Dark Crow, use the wind attack on the 3 in front. Take them out first, Ethan barked. In response, the Dark Crow's wings quivered. A familiar, coiled energy pulsed through its wing joints. Thanks to Ethan's constant training, the crow had learned to channel that power into razor-sharp gusts. With a mighty flap, it sent a whirlwind roaring forward, slicing through the 3 remaining bees before they even realized what hit them. Within moments, the once daunting swarm had been reduced to 2 terrified and now defeated giants. Ethan allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. Their partner may have been frightened, but with quick thinking and the Dark Crow's growing mastery of wind magic, they had the upper hand once more. Ethan flexed his wings, and in an instant a roaring white vortex erupted around the 3 giant hornets. Caught off guard by the elemental whirlwind, the hornets were swept up and spun helplessly into the sky. When the cyclone died away, its lingering gale battered them. 2 hornets tumbled to the ground, completely incapacitated. The third staggered, wings trembling, barely able to stay aloft. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Granted, the attribute advantage had helped, but more than that, it proved how far his dark crow had come. Its affinity for wind magic had deepened, and the force behind its whirlwind gust was now more devastating than ever. "All right," Ethan instructed. "Use Peck to finish off that one, then unleash another wind blast on the other two." At his command, the dark crow dove into position. Its ebony wings cut through the air with fierce precision, a trail of dark energy flickering in their wake. Ethan gripped the reins as the dark crow locked itself into the windward stance with flawless precision. Even without a direct command, it held that position as naturally as breathing. A single, crackling pang rang out when its white-hot beak slammed into the nearest sting bee like a sledgehammer. The second creature didn't stand a chance. Its life force snuffed out before it even hit the ground. Before he could catch his breath, the crow circled back to the two massive sting bees that had just shaken off their cowering fear. Though they'd recovered their footing, terror still flickered in their compound eyes. What had started as a clear numerical advantage for the insects was rapidly slipping away. Heart-pounding, Ethan watched as the dark crow funneled every ounce of energy into its wings, accelerating faster than ever before. Brilliant whirlwinds of white light spiraled around its talons, carving ribbons through the air. Then, with a piercing, triumphant whistle, the crow dove straight at the four trembling beasts. In a frenzy of panic, the two sting bees turned tail and fled the battlefield, their desperate shrieks trailing off into the distance. Ethan's keen ears picked up the faint buzz long before he saw his targets. In an instant, a fierce gust of wind erupted around him, and two gigantic needle beetles skittered sideways, trying to escape. But they never stood a chance. Ethan spun, channeling the flight system's raw energy into a devastating whirlwind that tore through them like a scythe. When the vortex dissipated, the two monsters lay crumpled on the forest floor, motionless, utterly defeated. At Ethan's side, the dark crow settled, a living weapon that had already cut down every ironclad crustacean and monstrous needle beetle in this grove. Silence fell for a heartbeat, broken only by a new mounting buzz from deeper within the trees. The needle beetles were regrouping, their numbers multiplying by the second. In their hive society, an affront to one was a summons to all, and now dozens, perhaps even hundreds, were converging on their position. Ethan met the crow's glossy black eyes. A single nod passed between them. There would be no glory in a head-on assault against an entire swarm. Better to fight another day. Without hesitation, Ethan turned away from the gathering hive, his boots whispering against the leaf-strewn ground as he slipped back into the forest's shadows. Retreat, for now, was his only choice. Ethan crouched just beyond the tree line as the giant needlebee swarm descended on the clearing, and what they found was carnage. Shattered iron automaton corpses lay tangled with the crushed bodies of their own kin across branches, bushes, and the forest floor. Enraged, the soldier bees fanned out in every direction, stingers at the ready, determined to hunt down whoever had wrought this devastation. Then, without warning, a thunderous buzz rolled through the uproar. From the heart of the swarm strode a colossal needlebee, its hulking form far larger than any of the others. Dark armor plates bristled along its back, and its venomous barb gleamed wickedly in the dim light. In a voice that vibrated through the air, it bellowed a single command, and at once every bee fell silent, aligning into a flawless formation as though they were soldiers on parade. Under their titanic leader's direction, the swarm then marched in perfect order, vanishing into the depths of the forest. Ethan, heart-pounding, watched them go, and only afterward did he realize that the gargantuan bee he'd glimpsed wasn't just another warrior but the true ruler of the hive, its prodigious size marking it as their commanding sovereign. Ethan strode through the gates of the iron-armored territory, the dark raven perched alertly on his shoulder. Their retreat had been hasty, but now that they'd made it back safely, there was no time to waste. Ethan reached into his pack, withdrew several black speed energy blocks from the storage compartment, and began feeding them to his raven companion, one by one. Though the dark raven had just unleashed a powerful skill during the skirmish, it hadn't taken serious damage, nor had it been overly fatigued. Still, Ethan knew better than to let his partner run on empty. Wild creatures like the raven needed constant replenishment if they were to remain at peak combat readiness, and today's mission was far from over. The raven greedily accepted each block, tearing at the edges with its hooked beak. As it consumed the condensed energy, glimmers of black and violet light pulsed beneath its feathers. Ethan watched the rhythmic glow, noting how the raven's mastery over flight energy seemed to deepen with every bite. The dark, malevolent energy woven into the blocks harmonized perfectly with the creature's own affinities, accelerating its recovery. With each block dissolved into the raven's system, a swirl of evil energy intertwined seamlessly with flight energy, strengthening tendons and sparking its keen senses to life. Ethan smiled at the sight. His companion was thriving, its wings already fluttering with renewed power. No matter what lay ahead in the iron-armored territory or beyond, Ethan and the Dark Raven would be ready. Ethan drew in a steady breath, letting tiny, almost invisible currents of energy flow into Dark Crow's body. Ever since the elf Forges had completed his mid-level energy blocks, his stamina replenished far faster than any ordinary elf's. Where others needed long hours or even days of rest after combat, Dark Crow now recovered almost instantly, emerging every time at peak efficiency. "Ready?" Ethan asked softly, running his fingers over the bird's smooth silken black feathers. "Today's mission won't be easy," Dark Crow responded with a sharp, confident caw. He swept one wing into a tight fist, thumping it against his chest as if to say, "I'm more than ready." A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips. With his companion freshly empowered, their plan stood every chance of succeeding. Chapter 19. Withdrawal. The sun hung high as Ethan and his Dark Crow familiar waged a relentless afternoon of hit-and-run skirmishes. Time and again they darted into the dense woods, struck at the iron-shelled beetle colonies before the creatures could mount an effective defense, then melted back into the shadows to rest. By day's end, 4 hives lay in ruins. Each victory yielded only a trickle of experience, but the steady accumulation pushed Dark Crow to level 14. Yet every time the main beetles fell, a few survivors, driven by blind fury, underwent a sudden metamorphosis. Their armored shells split apart, revealing the hulking forms of needlebees, creatures far deadlier than their previous selves. These newly evolved beasts tested Dark Crow's limits, forcing Ethan to measure each strike and conserve his strength. During their brief respites, Ethan pulled out his scanning chip and recorded every detail of the needlebees. Dozens of profiles filled his database, most standard red-tier specimens, only a handful bearing the rare orange-tier classification. With each new entry, Ethan's strategy grew sharper. If he hoped to press deeper into hostile territory, he'd need every advantage he could muster. As dusk painted the forest in long shadows, Ethan finally ordered a withdrawal. Dark Crow settled on his shoulder, feathers ruffled but gleaming with hard-won power. Ethan watched the fading light through the treetops, mind already racing through preparations for tomorrow's trials. A tactical retreat wasn't defeat, it was the pause before the next, even more crucial fight. This exercise makes one thing clear: high-quality elves are exceedingly rare, and a Dark Crow rated green is practically a prodigy. The difference between a red-grade sting bee and an orange-grade sting bee is stark. For one, the orange grade has an extra innate skill slot and superior growth potential across the board. At equal combat levels, a red-bronze bee falls to a single gust of the Dark Crow's wing, while an orange bumblebee can take at least 2 before it's truly beaten. It's exactly this gap that drives up the value of top-tier elves. The Rockets clearly pulled out every stop for this trial. Of the 300 test subjects, the lowest grade elf still carries an orange rating. After one skirmish after another, even with steady supplies of medium energy blocks, the Dark Crow shows strains of fatigue. His mind is wearing out long before his body. "Can you hold on?" Ethan asks quietly as he works the Dark Crow's unique pressure points, helping him recover more quickly. The Dark Crow doesn't reply in words, but after a moment's pause, he gives Ethan a firm nod. "Let's move before night falls," Hagi said, pushing himself up and brushing dust from his clothes. After a brief rest, Ethan climbed onto the Dark Raven's broad back, and together with Hagi, he slipped out of the armored subway's secured zone into the heart of Needlebee territory. We'd already wiped out 4 nests along the fringes, Ethan thought as they flew. With each hive they destroyed, the remaining iron-shelled crickets grew scarcer, forcing them to venture ever deeper where needle bees patrolled more frequently and more aggressively. Now, nearly 20 minutes beyond the last clear trail, Ethan spotted a grove of gnarled trees swollen with armored insects. Hundreds of iron-carapaced crickets clung to every branch, their glossy shells reflecting the dying light in a cold, ominous shimmer. Ethan settled low on the raven's back, studying them. Their numbers, without any natural predators, these sting bees could easily overrun the entire trial island. Hagi gripped his spear, eyes narrowed. That's exactly what the elves feared. So they raised undead legions in mass camps, stacking skulls and bones into living barricades. Their territories grew around those walls, effective enough to keep any apex creatures out. Ethan exhaled and flexed his fingers around the spear at his side. Then let's make sure these crickets become just another layer of their defenses. He glanced at Hagi. Read, why? Hagi gave a curt nod. Below them, the air buzzed with the frenzied hum of thousands of insect wings. Night was coming, and with it, a battle for survival deep in the heart of Needlebee Land. Ethan barely had time to signal Dark Crow to unleash another wind blast against the iron shells when the first of them appeared, immense needlebees bursting from the forest's edge. Ethan frowned. So soon? No, it looked like an advance guard. The needlebees were elves, a race that never left stragglers behind. Their sudden arrival meant the entire tribe had mobilized to stop him and Dark Crow. More giant bees erupted from the undergrowth, their wings drumming the air with a swelling, furious roar. Ethan recognized that glare in their compound eyes. They had every right to hate him. Not long ago, he had cut down nearly 100 of their kin and wiped out countless ironshell larvae in the same campaign. Such near-genocidal devastation would inflame any tribe. Ethan stood his ground, wind already crackling around Dark Crow's dark plumage. Around him, the massive needlebees swirled into a tightening circle. He knew this fight would be far harder than any before, but there was no turning back now. Ethan crouched low as wave after wave of giant needlebees streamed toward him. Something had changed in their ranks. An unmistakable commander had arisen, organizing them like an alpha wolf rallying its pack. A lone wolf is dangerous, and a pack more so, but a pack under a fearless leader? That's terror incarnate. The bees were tightening their circle, inching ever closer to an unbreakable siege. I can't let that happen, Ethan told himself. If they surround me completely, I'm finished. He forced his heartbeat to settle. The tiny neural chip embedded at the base of his skull hummed, scanning the terrain, calculating every possible escape route. Calm logic was his best weapon now. Above the buzzing maw, a harsh caw cracked the air. Caw, caw! The Dark Crow, Ethan's spirit guardian, swooped down, wings beating a furious rhythm. Even if the hive doubled in size, the crow would struggle against its sheer numbers, but in this moment its priority was clear. Distract the bees, and buy Ethan precious seconds. The swarm's attention flickered upward, drawn to the relentless screeching. As their lines wavered, Ethan edged backward, one careful step at a time, with the crow hovering at his side like a living flare. Each second of delay was everything. The needlebees swarmed closer, but never close enough. Inch by inch, cricket and spirit retreated, until, just before the bees could seal off every exit, Ethan slipped through a thinning gap. The Dark Crow let out one final triumphant cry as they vanished into the tall grass. The siege had been broken, this time. Buzz! A second, sharper beep sounded from behind the swarm of giant needlebees. Instantly, it was as if someone had flipped a switch. Every bee drill spiraled into a frenzy. Their crimson eyes burned brighter, and the roar of their wings pounded like an oncoming wave. Dark Crow, use gust to hold them back as long as you can, Ethan ordered, his voice steady. Then switch to peck and knock out any stragglers. We'll fall back. Thankfully, the needlebees hadn't completed their encirclement. Hundreds slammed against Dark Crow's front lines, but only 2 or 3 lagged at the rear. If Dark Crow could stall the main force with wind and clear those trailing behind, they still had a chance to escape. With a powerful beat of its ebony wings, Dark Crow summoned 2 massive white vortexes that roared to life between them and the swarming bee drill. Any bee that dared charge straight through was immediately sucked into the maelstrom, flung out dazed and powerless. Ethan seized the moment. Now! "Move," he shouted, and they slipped through the breach, Dark Crow's whirlwind roaring in their wake as the Needlebee's assault faded behind them. Ethan reached for the storage belt strapped around his waist and drew out a length of brownish cloth. He wrapped it around his head, hiding everything but his eyes, then plunged into the thick forest without hesitation. Two massive stinger bees hurtled toward him, wings beating in a furious buzz. Ethan didn't flinch. He knew his dark ravens would handle them. He'd already drawn on their wind magic once, but trusted they still had enough power left to clear these low-rank foes. In an instant, inky shapes whirred overhead and dove. Their beaks struck like twin lightning bolts, each black feathered talon puncturing a bee's thorax. Within moments, the two giant insects collapsed, wings stilled, falling lifeless to the leaf-strewn ground. Ethan exhaled, ready to press deeper into the trees, only to freeze when a swirling vortex of wind and shadow coalesced above him. In that churning maelstrom, a dark form loomed, poised to pluck him from below. The gale whipped around his legs, threatening to unbalance him. Then, with a deafening roar, a hulking figure emerged from the vortex. Feet planted firmly in the undergrowth. The creature raised its arm, where a lance of gleaming energy materialized, and thrust it forward. The spear of light cleaved through the storm, shattering the whirlwind in a cascade of leaves and bark. Silence fell. Ethan's heart pounded as he stared up at the newcomer, wondering whether this ally or enemy would decide his fate next. Ethan's heart skipped a beat when the gigantic shape appeared before him, a colossal sting bee easily twice the size of an ordinary specimen. He felt Yuguang stir at his side and glanced back, his pupils narrowing in alarm. This was no mere drone, but the hive's alpha, the behemoth destined to rule the colony. It hovered beyond the scanning range of Ethan's data chip, yet its sheer momentum told him it rivaled, or even exceeded, the power of the fallen Kairos. There was no time for wonder. Such a creature posed nothing but danger. Ethan broke into a faster run, urging the dark raven roosting on his shoulder to unleash its wind magic. With each mighty beat of its wings, the raven sent swirling gusts crashing into the pursuing swarm, buying Ethan precious distance. For nearly half an hour, they raced through the trees, Ethan weaving around thick trunks while the raven's winds scattered the giant needlebees. At last, deep in the uncharted heart of Iron Armor territory, the hive's hunters fell away. Ethan sank against the rough bark of an ancient ironwood, chest heaving. Since arriving in this world, he'd sustained himself on daily infusions of oil and water, and the breathing techniques he'd mastered in his past life. Finally, he could rest. Ethan's lungs were burning, but there was no choice. After half an hour of sprinting, he simply couldn't keep running any longer. He dropped to one knee, fighting for breath, a headache pounding at his temples as he remembered those swarms of giant needlebees he'd only just escaped. He'd assumed that, despite their numbers, these newly evolved bees would be easy prey. Limited flight ability meant he could methodically clear the territory, feed Dark Raven, and rack up experience without much trouble. But then, a leader had appeared, an exceptionally clever queen or alpha who could coordinate the entire hive on the fly. The difference a true leader makes in combat is staggering. What might look like a ragtag swarm suddenly fights as a single, crushing fist. That needlebee commander almost broke them. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. This was far trickier than he'd ever expected. Yet he and Dark Raven couldn't simply walk away now. They would have to rethink their strategy and strike back. I only caught a glimpse of the skirmish, so Ethan didn't have time to scan the stats on the great needlebee's leader. Still, the fact that he seized command of the hive so swiftly and without any challenge suggests his strength and credentials are anything but insignificant. Chapter 20. Elven Egg. This is the true test, isn't it? Battling the Dark Ravens had grown dull once they offered no real resistance. Even after destroying that giant needlebee, Dark Crow had felt no satisfaction. He was simply following Ethan's orders. Ethan knew this all too well, but there was nothing he could do, until now. When the massive queen of the needlebees finally appeared, Ethan sensed a spark of excitement ripple through the great black bird. He reached out and stroked Dark Crow's glossy feathers, shaking his head with a fond smile. "You really are a warrior," he murmured. "You need a worthy opponent to get your blood pumping." "Ka! Ka!" Dark Crow cried. banking and diving with incredible speed, the thrill of the coming battle lighting his eyes. Ethan pressed a hand to his temple. Today's swarm lay huddled beneath them like a giant hedgehog in its shell, proving impossible to draw out. A mild headache was forming, and the sun was already dipping below the treetops. Night was closing in. Even if he wanted to press the attack on the queen now, there simply wasn't time. With a soft sigh, Ethan leapt down from the branch to the forest floor. He'd have to wait until dawn to settle the score with the giant needlebee and to uncover whatever secrets the elven egg might hold. Ethan made his way back up the familiar hillside and built a roaring bonfire. Once the flames were crackling, he knelt beside his companion, Dark Crow, and began the customary full-body massage. "Dark Crow," Ethan said, picking up a sturdy wooden stick, "you're still a bit too weak to take on the big needlebee leader. We need to step up your training. You ready?" The crow gave a decisive "gah" and bobbed his head. He didn't mind a little hardship if it meant getting stronger. Ethan smiled. "All right, first a meal, then we'll move on to exercises." He scavenged 2 heavy logs, each about 5 pounds from the ground, then retrieved a length of strong rope from his pack. With careful knots, he secured 1 log to each of Dark Crow's wings. At first flutter, the bird stiffened at the sudden weight. What had once felt effortless now demanded every ounce of effort. Dark Crow staggered awkwardly into the air, wings beating furiously against the added resistance. For a tense moment, he hovered in place. Then, muscles adjusting, he found his rhythm. Each powerful flap became a little surer, a little stronger, exactly the challenge Ethan intended. As the firelight danced across the hillside, trainer and trainee pressed on, forging strength for the battles still to come. Ethan watched the glossy black crow flap its wings, already accustomed to the extra weight strapped to its back. He nodded in approval. "You've got the feel of it now. Next, circle that oak 100 times. He pointed to the giant tree at the edge of the clearing. Its limbs stretched wide overhead, and the trunk was so thick that 3 people linking arms could barely reach around it. A full lap around the base measured close to 20 meters. Without hesitation, the crow launched itself skyward and began its task, lap after lap, wings slicing through the cool air, never pausing. By the time it completed its 100th circle, dusk had fallen. Ethan stowed his gear, murmured a soft word of praise to his feathered companion, and settled in for the night beneath the oak's outstretched branches. When morning came, it brought another clear realization. 4 days had passed since their last trial test, and today was day 5. In 2 more days, the next exam would begin, and they still had one final challenge to face before they could return. Ethan crept into the thicket, pressing his chest against the damp earth. He pressed leaves and twigs into his clothing and laid a ragged strip of cloth around his head. Thick streaks of dark oil patterned his face in drifting lines, leaving only his eyes visible. The scent of fresh resin clung to his jacket, masking any hint of human presence. To a casual observer, the bramble patch would seem lifeless, no clue that a lone trainee lay hidden there, heart-pounding and senses razor-sharp. He paused to listen, every nerve alert. The trial was only days away, and every moment of stealth training counted. Soon, Ethan thought, he'd uncover what or who awaited him in the shadows. Ethan pressed himself flat against the cool earth beneath a low, yellowing bush, its red speckled leaves hiding him from view. He held his breath as the first wave of angry bee drill, they looked like oversized needle-bearing hornets, swooped down in a tight formation, their wings drumming the air. One by one, they whizzed past, searching for their quarry, until finally the last of them shouted a furious buzz and streaked away. He waited, unmoving, for 10 long minutes. In his previous life as an agent of Team Rocket, Ethan had faced far worse surprises. This simple camouflage was nothing. Here, he was protecting his partner, the Dark Crow. Left to its own devices, the crow's natural speed would have outrun the bee drill in seconds, alerting them to his presence and sending them straight for him. Better, Ethan decided, to let the bee drill exhaust themselves chasing the crow than risk discovery. At his silent command, the Dark Crow, its plumage slick midnight black, darted into view, cawing tauntingly. It flew with just enough restraint, gliding at a pace the bee drill could match, but never quite catch. The hornets pursued for minutes on end, their venomous stingers flashing, while their leader kept a tantalizing distance. Then, at last, the exhausted beedrill peeled off and dispersed back toward the wildflowers they'd been guarding. The dark crow banked gracefully, wings rustling, and landed beside the bush where Ethan waited. It gave a soft, approving caw, its signal that the danger had passed. Ethan exhaled, pushed himself upright, and brushed stray twigs from his dark hair. The path ahead lay clear, thanks to a little patience, a clever ruse, and the unerring loyalty of his mysterious avian companion. When they'd put enough distance between themselves and the needle-bee horde, Ethan and the dark crow caught a sudden gust, surged upward, and slipped from pursuit. Ethan, who'd lain motionless among the undergrowth like a piece of greenwood, finally stood, brushing soil from his shoulders and rubbing his aching feet, his untrained body still stiff from hours of hiding. He reached into his storage pouch, drew out a jet-black speed energy crystal, and offered it to the dark crow. The bird accepted it eagerly, its feathers ruffling with renewed vigor. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. With the massive needle bee colony safely drawn away, Ethan could now venture into the very heart of their territory. He and the dark crow pressed deeper into the forest, treading where even elves rarely dared to roam. Tangled brambles and underbrush thickened around them, and no sign of other beasts disturbed the silence. Towering sassafras trees loomed overhead, their stripped branches draped with spectral filaments, ancient remnants of the unicorn age. The crisp scent of fresh leaves and damp earth filled the air as they advanced. After a brisk 10-minute trek, the pair arrived at the center of the bees' domain. Here, the trees formed a natural cathedral, shafts of light piercing the canopy and illuminating a clearing carpeted in emerald moss. Ethan paused at the edge of that clearing, dark crow perched on his shoulder, and surveyed the silent heart of the hive's territory, ready to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within. Ethan perched on the rim of the enormous hive, easily 3 times the size of the great tree he normally called home, its walls made of hardened mud and woven twigs like some giant bird's nest. Behind him, the dark raven settled on the branch above, its beady eyes watching the scene intently. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding as he took in the sight. Inside the hive lay hundreds upon hundreds of oval eggs, each one the size of an elven child's fist. These were needle bee elf eggs, famed for hatching into tapeworm-like larvae that within days transformed first into unicorn-like steeds and then into swarms of fearsome needlebees. Though each individual lived only a few short weeks, their breeding speed was legendary, far faster than any other elven subspecies. Ethan swallowed hard, then brought out his scanning chip. A soft blue glow pulsed from its surface as he initiated a complete sweep of the hive. Lines of data scrolled in midair. Most eggs registered in the lowest, red tier, meaning poor viability. A smattering were orange, suggesting mediocre prospects, and rarer still, a precious few glowed yellow, the mark of high-quality stock. After a minute that felt like an hour, the scan finished. Over 500 eggs in total. Among them, only 25 were orange tier, and a mere 3 met the yellow standard. Ethan drew in a shaky breath, closing his eyes against the sudden wave of exhaustion. His head throbbed as reality set in. Even with these few viable hatchlings, managing and controlling a single needle bee brood was a monumental challenge, let alone this entire hive. Leaning his forehead against the rim of the nest, Ethan let out a long, defeated sigh. The dark raven ruffled its ebony feathers beside him, as if offering silent sympathy for the impossible task that lay ahead. Ethan paused, staring at the delicate elven eggs cradled within the hive. He'd never understood the point of destroying them. Apart from his enemies, he felt little cruelty in his heart. His own coldness was a tool, not a pleasure. A sudden tapping at his leg drew his attention. The dark crow perched beside him gave a sharp caw, bobbing its head and sweeping one wing toward a slender branch above. Ethan followed its gesture and looked up. Nestled in the treetops was a smaller, more ornate hive, clearly the lair of the queen needlebees. With a soft flap of its wings, the crow led the way. Ethan climbed carefully, using hidden vines as footholds until he reached the upper nest. Inside, 3 elven eggs gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight, 2 a pale yellow, 1 an otherworldly green. Ethan tapped the chip embedded in his wrist. A quiet hum filled his ear as the scanner swept the eggs. When the data window appeared, he felt a jolt of surprise. Puppet elf, unicorn, egg form, color green, gender female, level 1, attributes, insect system, poison system, traits, unknown, equipment, none, genetic skills, insect bite, gas gathering, basic skills, none, teaching skills, none, skill learner, none. Ethan's breath caught. He raised a flask to his lips and swallowed a slow, steady sip of water, trying to make sense of the unexpected discovery. The green egg pulsed softly, as though aware of the scrutiny, and Ethan realized that whatever hatched from it could change everything. This was the first time Ethan had ever encountered an unhatched elf egg rated at the green level. Though the creature inside was nothing more imposing than a common unicorn, reaching green status among elves significantly eased the usual racial restrictions. Ethan could tell at a glance that this egg belonged to the great Needle Bee Chief. Judging by the ratings of the 3 eggs laid at once, the chief himself must rank at least yellow, possibly even green. In elf society, offspring inherit their parents' qualifications within 1 grade. If a parent is yellow, a child's rating can dip no lower than orange and will typically be yellow, though an exceptional hatchling might achieve green. When the parents differ in standing, various outcomes are possible, but an elf's birth rank never falls more than 1 tier below the lower qualified parent, nor does it climb more than 1 tier above the higher qualified parent. Staring at the smooth, opalescent shell of the unicorn egg, Ethan felt a thrill of anticipation. Whatever lay inside promised to be extraordinary. Ethan eyed the unicorn egg cradled in his palm. Its rich emerald sheen marked it as a true green tier specimen, almost certainly the offspring of yellow tier, if not green tier parents. He knew he had to secure it carefully. Tearing a strip from his own shirt, Ethan wrapped the egg gently, tied the ends in a tight knot across his back, then gave a light hop to make sure it wouldn't slip. It stayed perfectly in place. He paused, recalling a hard-learned lesson. Living Pokémon eggs must never go into the storage system. Those compartments are designed only for inanimates. Anything alive placed inside would perish instantly. He'd seen it happen before and refused to let it happen again. With the egg safe against his shoulder, Ethan couldn't help but grin. He wasn't about to abandon such a prize. Whether he chose to hatch it himself or sell it, perhaps to Team Rocket or some other collector, he already knew this green-tier unicorn egg would fetch a fortune. As a former Pokémon hunter, Ethan was more than familiar with deals like this and was determined to make the most of it.